Hi guys. Tonight we begin by stepping into the echoing stone corridors of a medieval castle. The torches flicker along the walls, and you can almost hear the faint whistle of the wind sneaking through cracks in the heavy wooden doors. It's the kind of setting that looks romantic when you visit as a tourist, but if you had to actually live here, especially on a winter's night, you would probably regret it before the first hour passed. The reality is simple. Castles were freezing, and if you had to sleep inside one without central heating, insulated windows, or even a decent mattress by modern standards, you'd discover quickly that your biggest enemy wasn't rival knights. It was the cold. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a few tricks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world people are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, let your breathing slow, and imagine yourself preparing for bed in a medieval stronghold. You trudge across the flagstone floor of a great chamber, boots scraping against surfaces worn smooth by centuries of feet. The cold bites at your skin, even though you're fully dressed. The stone walls don't simply resist warmth, they swallow it whole. Historians often describe castles as marvels of defense, but rarely as marvels of comfort. And here's the blunt truth. Those same thick walls that could shrug off a battering ram also trapped cold air like a giant refrigerator. Once, the sun dropped. The inside temperature plummeted almost as quickly as the outside. You'd notice your breath forming clouds in front of your face. The air inside feels heavy, damp, and unwelcoming. Castles were designed to keep enemies out, not to keep the chill away. The architects thought about moats, drawbridges, arrow slits, but insulation wasn't really on their blueprints. A mainstream fact worth remembering is that many castles in northern Europe were strategically placed on windswept hills. From a military standpoint, that was brilliant. You could see invaders coming, and the slopes gave you a defensive advantage. But from the perspective of someone trying to get some sleep, it was a curse. Wind scoured every surface and forced icy drafts through gaps in shutters and under doors. You couldn't ask for a worse sleeping environment if you tried. You might think the fireplaces would save you, but no. Even a roaring fire in the great hall barely warmed the immediate circle around it. And the further you moved from the presos, flames, the colder it became. By the time you shuffled toward your bedchamber, the temperature could feel more like a cellar than a living space. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. In some records, from the late medieval period, travelers wrote about the shock of frost forming inside the bedrooms of castles. Imagine waking up with icicles hanging from your bed curtains or discovering the wash basin frozen solid. Chroniclers treated this as almost normal, not worth more than a passing mention. If your chamber didn't grow a thin layer of rime on the walls in January, it meant you were in the minority. And yet, despite this, people survived. Somehow, they figured out ways to keep their bodies from becoming popsicles. Part of that survival instinct involved ritual. As night fell, entire households followed, patterns meant to trap whatever warmth they could. The castle might be vast, but the focus was always on shrinking the living space at night. Fires were banked, beds were arranged with crimes, curtains, clothes were layered until mobility was a secondary concern, and everyone hoped the draft wouldn't be too cruel. You picture yourself walking into a medieval bedchamber. The bed itself is an impressive piece of carpentry raised high above the floor. That wasn't for style. It was a strategy to escape the coldest layer of air, which always sinks. Even so, the stone radiates chill, upward, and your body feels it the moment you climb under the covers. Historians still argue whether castles truly became more comfortable as centuries passed, or whether the myths of cozy, noble life were exaggerated by later storytellers. Some suggest that tapestries and thick draperies genuinely transformed rooms into warmer spaces, while others insist that the cold always won, no matter how much fabric you hung on the walls. The truth probably lies in the middle. Things improved somewhat, but never to the level of real comfort. You lie back in this imagined bed, the wooden frame creaking as straw-stitched bedding rustles beneath you. Outside, the wind moans against the battlements. The only light is from a small oil lamp guttering near the bedside, and even that feels like it struggles to stay alive. Your toes already begin to ache with the sharp cold, even though you're still wrapped in your daytime clothes. And then the sounds of a castle night filter in. The distant echo of boots on stone as a guard changes watch. The creak of rafters under frost. A dog barking faintly in the courtyard, its voice muffled by the thickness of the walls. You might even hear the drip of water freezing somewhere nearby. None of it helps you feel warmer. Instead, it reminds you that the world outside is unforgiving. It's tempting to imagine the nobility snuggled in perfect comfort, while peasants froze in their cottages. But here's the funny thing. Sometimes the peasants had it better. Their homes, built of wood and daub, might trap heat from the hearth more efficiently than the vast, cavernous chambers of a lord's keep. A single fire in a small hut could keep an entire family decently warm. Meanwhile, you, a noble in a castle, could shiver in a stone box so large that even 5 roaring fireplaces wouldn't make a dent. That irony wasn't lost on contemporaries. A few surviving letters from clerics and noble visitors remark on the difficulty of getting restful sleep in castles during the winter. They describe the beds as grand, but the nights as bitter. Some even advise travellers to pack extra cloaks, not for show, but for survival. As you continue picturing yourself lying there, you begin to appreciate the ingenuity it must have taken just to get through the night. You didn't simply crawl under a blanket and hope for the best. You layered fabrics, stacked furs, pulled curtains tight, and sometimes even shared your bed with companions, human or otherwise. Every step was about creating microclimates, little zones of warmth in an environment designed by nature and architecture to be relentlessly cold. The experience reshapes how you think about medieval life. These people weren't just warriors and lords, monks and maidens. They were survivalists. Every bedtime was a test, every winter a trial, and sleep, which we now consider an effortless luxury, had to be engineered carefully with rituals passed down across generations. Imagine how grateful you'd feel for every flicker of warmth, the sudden comfort of a dog pressed against your feet, the thrill of hot stones placed near your bedding, the tiny victory of keeping frost off your beard through the night. These moments would stick with you far more vividly than any banquet or hunt. Survival was memorable. So tonight, as you lie in your modern bed, with your central heating humming softly, you can spare a thought for those who once lay shivering in stone chambers. Their nights were long, their mornings bitter, and yet they endured. They found a way to sleep in places that should have been uninhabitable. That ingenuity is what we'll continue to explore layer by layer, trick by trick, as this story carries you deeper into the medieval night. You step into the great hall now, the beating heart of any medieval castle. If the bedchamber was a tomb of stone and draughts, this place is at least alive with flickers of warmth. Long trestle tables stretch across the floor, their wooden surfaces polished by countless elbows and tankers. The air smells of roasted meat, spilt ale, damp wool, and smoke that never fully leaves the rafters. The fire in the central hearth roars brightly, a defiant square of orange heat against the creeping winter darkness. This is where the castle felt most alive after sunset. People gathered here, not only for food, but also to absorb as much warmth as possible before retreating to their icy chambers. Servants dart back and forth carrying trenchers of bread, jugs of ale, and great platters of steaming pottage. Dogs scavenge, underfoot, tails wagging, hoping for scraps. The hall is loud, almost raucous, with laughter, song, and the clattering of knives against plates. For a little while, you forget that outside the wind howls across the battlements, and frost is forming on the windows. Here's the plain fact. The Great Hall was the only space in most castles where heating was even remotely successful. A huge open hearth dominated the centre or end of the room, and the fire was fed almost constantly in winter. Logs, sometimes entire tree trunks, were hauled in to keep it going. If you had rank, you claimed a seat near it, basking in that golden glow, while servants, or less fortunate souls, shivered along the edges. But here's the catch. Even in this grand room, the heat only travelled so far. The farther you sat from the flames, the colder the air became, until it felt as though the walls themselves breathed out frost. Heat rose upward, trapped in the smoke-stained rafters, while those on the floor wrapped themselves in cloaks and huddled together. In truth, only a lucky few were ever warm, and everyone else pretended to be. One quirky tidbit that chroniclers mention is that feasts sometimes doubled as strategic heating sessions. Nobles scheduled their largest gatherings during the bitter months, knowing that the body heat of hundreds of guests combined with the fire would turn the Great Hall into something approaching cozy. In some accounts, it's even said that servants were told to stand closer together simply to generate extra warmth. You could say that feasting was as much about survival as it was about merrymaking. But the glow of the hall didn't last. When the feast wound down, the minstrels packed away their instruments, and the guests staggered off to their beds. The fire was eventually allowed to burn low. Embers glowed red. A last stand against Fort as Avonlea. The cold and shadows grew long on the stone walls. That heat you clung to during the evening dissipated quickly. Within an hour or two, the Great Hall itself would fall back into frigid silence. Imagine yourself now. You're lingering by the fire, unwilling to leave, stretching your hands to soak up every last spark of warmth. Your cheeks glow hot, but the back of your body already feels the cold creeping in, reminding you of what waits upstairs. The smoke stings your eyes and clings to your hair, but you still dread the moment when you have to climb the spiral staircase to your chamber. Historians still debate whether some castles developed more sophisticated heating systems for their great halls. A few argue that vents and flue allowed the public warmth to circulate, especially in later centuries. Others suggest this is wishful thinking, pointing out that medieval building technology simply didn't prioritize comfort. The consensus leans toward the harsher truth. The Great Hall was warm only in the immediate vicinity of the fire and nowhere else. Even the acoustics reminded you that this wasn't a cozy lodge but a cavernous chamber of power. Every laugh echoed. Every footstep amplified until the soundscape itself seemed too large, too cold. And when the hall emptied, the silence became oppressive, like sitting in the belly of a sleeping giant. One of the most telling images is the transition itself, the walk from the Great Hall to your bedchamber. Picture leaving the golden firelight, stepping into a narrow passage lit by a single torch. The draft hits you instantly, a knife of cold air rushing through arrow slits and unsealed doorways. Your breath fogs again. The warmth you just carried in your bones drains away as though the castle itself is feeding on it. That shift from one room of temporary comfort to the endless chill beyond defined medieval nights. Sometimes nobles lingered so long in the Great Hall that they practically slept there. A high-backed bench pulled close to the hearth could serve as a makeshift bed, and servants or guards often collapsed near the embers rather than face their chambers. To sleep near the fire was to risk sparks, smoke, and restless noise, but compared to the icy stone above, it was still tempting. Another curious note from the records. Travellers often complained more about the journey from the Great Hall to the sleeping quarters than the sleep itself. That brief exposure, moving from warmth into cold, was described as a shock to the body. People spoke of shivers, lasting all night because of that walk. It's as if the castle itself punished you for daring to think you might be comfortable. The fading glow of the hall was psychological too. You knew that once you left it behind, the night would be long and merciless. The Great Hall was not just a room, it was a ritual, a gathering of warmth before surrendering to the cold. Every torch put out, every cup drained, was another step toward a shivering ordeal in bed. Even in the flicker of candlelight, you sense how temporary comfort really was. The fire that once roared now whispers faintly, sparks popping and dying. A servant pokes at it half-heartedly, then gives up, leaving the embers to fade. The sound of laughter and feasting is gone, replaced by the quiet groans of the castle settling into the night. And so you turn reluctantly to climb that staircase, cloak wrapped tightly around you, the memory of warmth fading with each step. The glow of the great hall lingers in your mind like a dream you wish could last, but already your toes, numb, your fingers sting, and you realize the rest of the night will be a fight for heat. That fleeting glow is what kept people sane. The ritual of gathering, feasting, and basking in fire, the light before the cold reclaimed its territory. Without the great hall, the castle would have been unbearable. With it, people at least had a chance to remember what warmth felt like, if only for a few hours. You climb higher into the keep now, away from the fading glow of the great hall, and the air changes immediately. The warmth of the fire is gone, replaced by a damp cold that clings to your bones. The walls are thick, thicker than anything you've seen in modern houses, sometimes 12 feet of stone separating you from the outside world. At first, that sounds like protection, but here's the irony. Those very walls that stopped arrows and siege engines also trap the chill inside. If you've ever stepped into a basement in winter, you know the sensation. The stone holds the temperature like a memory, radiating cold, even when the outside air warms briefly. Medieval. Builders understood strength and permanence, but not comfort, and so the walls became paradoxical. Fortresses, against men, but not against the weather. One fact historians agree on is that castles rarely warmed beyond a narrow radius around the hearth. A fire blazed, smoke curled upward, but stepped just 10 feet away, and you were already in an icebox again. Written accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families sitting directly in front of the flames, cloaks pulled over their heads, while behind them servants stamped their feet to keep circulation going. The fire created a bubble of tolerable heat, but the stone around it to refuse to yield. Now, a curious note from travellers' journals. Some complained that the walls themselves sweated. Moisture condensed on the cold stone and ran down in streaks, making chambers damp and unpleasant. Imagine lying in bed and hearing tiny drips hitting the floor beside you all night long. Not exactly the lullaby you wanted. In some seasons, moss even grew on the interior surfaces. So yes, you lived inside a castle, but at times it resembled more of a cave. Modern scholars still wrestle with the question of whether tapestries and hangings really made much difference. We picture grand walls lined with richly woven cloth, but did those thick fabrics truly insulate the room, or did they merely decorate? Some researchers argue they cut drafts noticeably, creating pockets of warmth behind the drapery. Others think this was exaggerated in later romanticized depictions, pointing out that even the richest cloth couldn't compete with freezing air filtering through unglazed windows and door cracks. The debate lingers unresolved, but it tells you one thing clearly. People were desperate enough to try almost anything. So, picture it now. You enter a bedchamber in late January. The fire in the hearth is small, perhaps already guttering. The walls rise like cliffs around you, their surface slick with condensation, even wrapped in layers of wool. You shiver. The bed stands proud in the center, heavy curtains drawn around it, Behind those curtains, the air might be a few degrees warmer, a little cocoon carved out of the cold, but outside them the chamber feels like a stone tomb. The psychological effect was just as severe. People wrote about dreading the cold more than hunger or even illness. At least hunger and illness passed, eventually. The cold was relentless every single night of the winter season. When you lived in a castle, you couldn't escape it. That sense of imprisonment in your own home left its mark. You imagine lying there, pulling the coverlet tight, listening to the hiss of wind sneaking through arrow slits. Your ears burn with cold, your fingers stiffen. Even your dreams, when they come, are haunted by images of ice and fire. The stone walls surround you not like a protective shield, but like a refrigerator that never switches off. And here's where your perspective shifts. Castles weren't glamorous in daily life. They were survival machines, yes, but they made you pay a price for that protection. Comfort was sacrificed for security, and every winter's night reminded you that stone might keep you safe from arrows, but it would never keep you warm. The more you think about it, the clearer it becomes. Sleeping in a medieval castle was less about resting peacefully and more about staging a small war against the environment. The enemy was invisible, but merciless, and the battlefield was always the same. Your chamber, your bed, your body. You shuffle across the chamber floor, and instead of carpets or polished wood, your boots crunch against something far humbler, rushes strewn across the stone. These weren't just decoration, they were a practical attempt to soften the cold underfoot, soak up spills, and most importantly, act as a crude form of insulation. Documents from the later Middle Ages describe how households renewed the rushes a few times each year, layering them thick in noble halls and chambers. When freshly laid, they smelled faintly of the outdoors, grassy, earthy, almost pleasant. For a little while, you might feel as though a part of summer had been carried inside. The plants added padding, muffled footsteps, and helped hold in what little warmth could be trapped near the ground. But the charm didn't last. Over time, the rushes grew foul. Food scraps, spilled ale, and stray bones from the feast lodged themselves within. Mice and insects treated the floor as their playground. If you're picturing a cozy, natural carpet, think again. By the end of winter, the rushes could be so filthy that one French moralist complained it was like sleeping in a Maidan. What strikes you as fascinating is how these rushes worked double duty. Yes, they trapped a thin layer of warmth, but they also absorbed moisture from the damp stone. In a castle where condensation dripped constantly from the walls, this mattered. Otherwise, every step would have been across slick stone and puddles of freezing water. A peculiar aside appears in some English household accounts. Herbs such as lavender, rosemary, or meadow were sometimes sprinkled among the rushes. The idea was partly practical. Strong-smelling plants disguised odour from rotting scraps, but it also provided a whiff of comfort in rooms otherwise thick with smoke and damp. Imagine settling into bed and catching a faint note of lavender beneath the overwhelming scent of wet wool and wood smoke. It wouldn't make you warmer, but it might make the night a little more bearable. There's an ongoing debate among architectural historians about just how effective these rushes really were. Some argue they genuinely provided warmth by creating an insulating mat between human feet and icy stone. Others dismiss them as largely symbolic gestures of order and cleanliness, pointing out that most of the heat loss came from walls and ceilings. Anyway, the evidence is patchy, and so the question lingers: were the rushes a true medieval technology of warmth, or simply a messy habit disguised as tradition? You picture yourself now lying in bed, while a servant finishes scattering new rushes across the chamber. They crunch softly underfoot, releasing faint aromas as they're trampled down. For a fleeting moment, the room feels cleaner, almost civilized. But you know that by morning, the rushes will already have absorbed the dampness, and the cycle of decay will to begin again. Think of the sensory overload of such a bedroom. Beneath your sheets, you might feel the comfort of wool or fur, but rising around you is the musty smell of old rushes, the sharp tang of herbs, and the omnipresent smoke clinging to your clothes. The floor rustles as mice scurry in search of crumbs. Every detail reminds you that survival, not luxury, defined your sleep. Yet there's a kind of ingenuity in it too. These people used the simplest materials plants gathered from riverbanks and fields and turned them into tools for enduring the long winter. They didn't think in terms of carpets or insulation. They thought in terms of whatever could keep the chill a fraction further away. So as you rest your head in this imagined chamber, you realize that even the floor beneath you was part of the nightly battle against the cold. Stone was the enemy, rushes with a fragile shield. And every morning began with the question, how long until these two betrayed you with dampness and decay? You sit on the edge of the bed, now, running your fingers across the layers of cloth piled high. If there was one medieval survival secret against the pot, night chill, it was fabric. Wool, linen, and fur became the weapons of choice, wrapped and layered until you resembled a cocoon rather than a sleeper. Records from household inventories make it clear just how central textiles were to medieval life. Linen sheets were considered the baseline, smooth and cool against the skin, though far less insulating than what came on top. Over that came thick woolen blankets, heavy enough that some people compared them to the weight of a hound. And if you had the wealth, you added fur collets, fox, sable, or even bear. Nobles invested fortunes into such bedding, not only for show, but because without it, winter nights could be lethal. But there's an amusing observation buried in the sources. Servants sometimes joked that their masters couldn't move once they were tucked in. So many layers pinned them down that turning over required a monumental effort. Imagine being swaddled in 5 or 6 heavy blankets, so tightly tucked that you either lay still or risked pulling the covers off and freezing. Warmth came at the cost of mobility, a trade-off most were willing to make. Fur deserves special attention. Beyond luxury, it was genuinely practical. Arctic fox pelts, marten skins, and sheepkin all provided dense warmth. One chronicler describes a noble woman in Burgundy who refused to travel without her iron-lined bed covers, even in summer, because she feared catching chills at night. To us, it sounds absurd, but in an age where drafts slice through every room, paranoia about cold was entirely rational. A strange custom pops up in certain households. Some people believed sleeping under too much linen was unhealthy, because linen was thought to draw out the body's heat. To balance this, they deliberately layered wool or fur above and below, creating what we might call a textile sandwich. The idea was that linen cooled, wool heated, and fur trapped it all in. Whether the theory worked scientifically is doubtful, but it shows how people mixed folklore with practical comfort. Scholars continue to puzzle over the social meaning of these textiles. Was fur really about survival, or was it mostly status signaling? On one hand, inventories prove that wealthy nobles collected enormous numbers of fur coats. On the other hand, poor families survived without them, relying on coarse wool instead. Some historians argue that furs were primarily symbols of power and rank, while others maintain they were a crucial necessity in drafty castles. The truth likely sat somewhere in between. They were both life-saving tools and markers of prestige. Now imagine yourself beneath these layers. The wool itches faintly against your skin, rougher than modern textiles. Above that, the fur feels dense and almost suffocating, but at least it keeps the cold at bay. The blankets press you into the straw mattress with their sheer weight. You shift, but only slightly. Any bigger movement would invite icy air into the cocoon. Your breath warms the space around your face. While the rest of you relies entirely on the barrier of cloth, the silence of the room amplifies every sensation. The rustle of linen, the coarse scratch of wool, the faint musky odor of animal pelts. There's something intimate and primal about it. You are wrapped in the skins and fibers of the natural world. Every thread and hair a reminder that survival depends on turning the environment itself into armor. And in that thought lies the essence of medieval sleep. To rest was to build a fortress inside a fortress, not with battlements and mows, but with sheets and furs. Each night, you barricaded yourself against the cold with whatever textiles you could muster. Without them, even the most magnificent castle chamber would feel like the inside of a crypt. So, as you lie there in this imagined cocoon, you begin to understand the nightly ritual. Gather layers, weigh yourself down, and hope they hold until morning. The cold might rattle the shutters, creep through the stones, and swirl around your bed. But inside the bed, fortress of fabric, you stood a fighting chance. The bed itself was more than a piece of furniture. It was a machine designed to create a small, livable climate inside an otherwise hostile the room. When you draw back the heavy curtains of a medieval four-poster, you aren't just peeking into someone's private sleeping space. You're stepping into a micro-world built for survival. Detailed inventories from noble households show how important these great beds were. Unlike the simple pallets of peasants, these frames rose off the ground, tall as a person, carved from oak or walnut. The posts stood like pillars, often ornately decorated, and stretched upward to support a canopy. That canopy wasn't only decorative, it was practical. By draping curtains down the sides, you trapped your own body heat inside. It turned an icy chamber into something faintly resembling warmth. Think of it like a medieval tent inside your bedroom. Once the curtains were closed, the difference could be dramatic. The heat from your breath, from your body, from the thick bedding, all collected within a drafty room where the temperature might hover just above freezing. Those extra few degrees the difference between a miserable night and something tolerable. There's an off-cited record from a French duchess who travelled with her bed, dismantled and packed on carts. Why go to that trouble? Because the bed wasn't roomy, just furniture. It was life support. To sleep in an unfamiliar castle or abbey without your own canopy and curtains was to risk shivering all night long. A curious detail crops up in some English sources. The curtains themselves were sometimes waxed or lined with oiled cloth to block drafts more effectively. Imagine pulling those curtains closed, the fabric heavy, faintly smelling of beeswax or resin. They didn't just block the cold. They also created darkness, muffling sound and light, giving the illusion of privacy in rooms that were rarely truly private. Modern scholars still discuss how effective these beds really were. Did they genuinely warm sleepers, or do later romantic depictions exaggerate their usefulness? Archaeological evidence suggests the curtains were thick and layered, so there's reason to believe they worked. Yet, some argue the warmth was psychological as much as physical. The feeling of being enclosed, sheltered, hidden away from the cavernous cold. The debate continues. But what remains certain is that people believed in their importance so strongly that portable beds became a noble necessity. Now, picture yourself sliding into one. The bed cacks under your weight. The straw mattress rustles. And then you reach to pull the curtain closed. Instantly, the air feels different. Still cold, yes, but no longer assaulted by drafts from the arrow slits. Your breath fogs less quickly. Your body relaxes into the layered covers, and you sense that you might actually fall asleep. The curtain muffles the faint drip of water from the walls, the distant cough of a servant in the hallway, even the bark of a dog outside. Inside, it smells of fabric and fur, faintly musky but comforting. You hear only the rustle of your blankets when you shift. The chamber beyond may be vast and inhospitable, but here, in your bed, you've carved out a pocket of life against the elements. It wasn't foolproof. Some nights the curtains froze stiff where condensation collected. Other nights, the smoke from the hearth drifted inside, choking you, awake. But for most nobles, the four-poster canopy bed represented the best defense available against the nightly siege of cold. And this is where you realize the ingenuity of medieval people wasn't in grand inventions, but in small, clever adaptations. No central heating? Then build a private climate bubble. No insulation. Then hang thick curtains and seal yourself in. Every night was a negotiation with the cold, and the canopy bed was the closest thing to a truce. Imagine lying there now, your eyelids heavy, the world beyond the curtain fading into silence. The chamber is still cold, the castle still drafty, but you've made a space where survival feels possible. You drift towards sleep, not because the night has grown warmer, but because you've managed, through fabric and wood, to outwit it just enough. Beneath all those blankets and curtains, the foundation of your night's rest was still the mattress itself. What lay under you could determine whether you passed the night in some level of comfort, or whether you woke aching, frozen, and cranky. In the Middle Ages, bedding came in many forms, but two stood out: the feather bed and the straw tick. The feather bed was the luxury choice. Imagine sinking into a sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, soft and pliable, cradling your body with warmth. Inventories from noble estates often list multiple feather beds, carefully stored and moved with the household whenever the lord travelled. A well-stuffed feather mattress could be so thick that one sat nearly a foot above the bed frame, a bouncy cushion in an otherwise unforgiving chamber. Families prized them, guarded them, and passed them down as treasured possessions. They weren't simply comfortable, they were symbols of status. But here's a twist. Feather beds could also become suffocatingly hot, trapping body heat until sleepers woke drenched in sweat, even in winter. One amusing complaint survives from a 15th century letter where a guest moaned that his host's bed swallowed him like a plaint, goose in a pot. Too many feathers meant you sank too deep, and instead of gently, cushioned sleep, you spent the night struggling to crawl back to the surface. For most people, though, the reality was a straw tick, a large sack filled with straw, hay, or reeds, stuffed until it formed a crude mattress. Peasants used them, soldiers used them, and even castles filled their lesser chambers with them. They were cheap, easy to refill, and moderately effective at lifting you off the icy floor. But straw came with its own curses. It flattened quickly, poked through the cloth, and often harboured fleas. Households had to beat the bed regularly, literally whacking and shaking the straw sack to fluff it up and drive out vermin. By morning, your body might itch from straw scratches, but at least you'd survived the night. Contemporary sources note a strange detail. Some people mixed herbs into the straw, not only to sweeten the dry smell, but also to ward off pests. Lavender, mint, or pennyroyal might be tossed in, leaving a faint fragrance that masked the sour odour of damp hay. If you've ever slept on a straw-stuffed mattress, you know the smell never quite leaves. It lingers, earthy and musty, seeping into clothes and hair. Researchers still debate just how common feather beds really were. Some argue they were rare luxuries reserved for the very top tier of society. Others point to records showing middling households owning at least one feather bed, suggesting they were more widespread than assumed. The disagreement comes down to patchy evidence. But what it reveals is that sleeping surfaces matter deeply enough to be meticulously recorded. Imagine yourself lying down on a straw tick in a drafty chamber. The sack rustles beneath you, uneven lumps pressing against your back. Each shift releases a puff of grassy scent, mixed with the faint sharpness of herbs. You hear the tiny scurry of mice somewhere within the rushes on the floor, and you wonder if they'll pay you a visit. The blankets above press heavy, but the straw below reminds you that comfort in this age was never guaranteed. Now, picture the alternative, a feather bed in a noble room. You sink deep into the softness, your body embraced by down. It feels heavenly until the warmth grows, stifling. The feathers shift, and you roll into a hollow that cradles you a little too tightly. You push at the blankets, searching for fresh air, but the curtains trap everything in. You fall back asleep anyway, knowing this discomfort is still 1,000 times better than straw. The choice between straw and feathers mirrored the medieval social ladder. To lie on feathers was to belong to the privileged. To lie on straw was to accept necessity. Both, however, were responses to the same challenge, keeping the body alive in cold, unforgiving stone chambers. And so, as you drift off in your imagined bed tonight, you realize that medieval sleepers were never passive. Every mattress, whether humble or grand, represented effort, adaptation, and a small victory over the cold. You didn't just collapse into bed. You made a strategic decision: sink into feathers or endure straw, all in the hope of surviving until dawn. Even the most carefully built bed, with its curtains, feather mattresses, and heaps of blankets, couldn't always guarantee survival on its own. What made the difference on the coldest nights wasn't furniture, it was company. Sleeping, alone in a stone chamber, meant your body heat simply bled into the walls. Sleeping beside others meant warmth multiplied. Bodies acting like radiators pressed together in the dark. Noble families understood this, though they rarely admitted it openly. Servants often slept in adjoining rooms or even on pallets at the foot of the master's bed. The arrangement wasn't only about service or security, it was also practical. More people in a space meant higher temperatures, even if only by a few precious degrees. You might not notice the warmth at first, but come midnight, when frost gathered on the inside of the shutters, every extra body counted. Accounts from medieval monasteries reveal that monks slept in long rows, their cots or straw beds side by side in drafty dormitories. The reasoning wasn't solely communal discipline, it was also survival. In those crowded quarters, body heat created a layer of insulation, however thin. The same principle applied in barracks, where soldiers huddled in rows, cloaks pulled tight, trusting that together they'd resist the chill better than alone. A curious anecdote comes from a 14th century English manor. One nobleman's will specifically ordered that his favourite squire be granted a place near his lord's chamber, fire at night. Scholars interpret this not only as a mark of favour, but as an admission that the warmth of companionship was as valuable as inheritance. To be invited to share a bed or chamber was not merely intimacy, it was a privilege of warmth. There was, of course, another layer to the practice. Animals. Dogs in particular became literal heaters. The phrase "a three-dog night" may come from much later folklore, but the idea is rooted in reality. Medieval people often allowed hounds into the bed, not only for companionship, but because the animals radiated heat. A couple of large mastiffs curled at your feet might mean the difference between numb toes and comfort. Travellers even recorded that in some inns guests slept packed together, with dogs, goats, or even sheep beside them. The smell was intense, but warmth trumped fragrance. Scholarly debate continues over just how socially acceptable bed sharing was among nobles. Some argue it was routine lords with trusted companions, ladies with maids, travellers with strangers. Others insist that among the elite such intimacy was limited and carefully controlled, with servants relegated to nearby pallets rather than inside the bed itself. What is clear, however, is that in lower classes, bed sharing was normal. Families piled together, parents, children, and often grandparents, forming a tangle of limbs under a single heap of blankets. Privacy meant little when survival was at stake. Imagine now that you lie in such a bed, not alone, but pressed shoulder to shoulder with others. The first few minutes feel awkward. Elbows poke. Someone coughs. A blanket slips. But soon the warmth builds. A shared cocoon of body heat. You feel the dog's weight against your feet, hear the soft breathing of your companions, and slowly your muscles unclench. The castle may howl with wind, but inside this cluster you almost believe in comfort. Of course, this came with drawbacks. Fleas and lice spread easily, and whispers in the dark carried secrets. But when you weighed those irritations against the risk of shivering through a sleepless night, the choice was simple. You chose warmth over dignity, companionship over solitude. To modern minds, the thought of sharing a bed with servants, siblings, or animals may feel uncomfortable. But for the medieval sleeper, it was survival, strategy passed down and accepted as common sense. In a world of stone and frost, every extra body was a blessing. So, as you pull your own blanket tighter tonight, think of those long-ago sleepers who faced the same cold but had fewer defenses. Their solution was simple. Share what warmth you had and hope the night would be merciful. Imagine blowing out your candle and settling under the covers. It isn't just the blankets or the bed curtains that keep you alive tonight. It's also what you're wearing. Unlike the modern custom of slipping into pajamas or even nothing at all, medieval people often went to sleep nearly as bundled up as they were by day. Clothing itself became part of the insulation system. Household accounts and surviving garments show that the staple bedtime attire was the nightshirt, a long, loose linen garment resembling an oversized tunic. Linen might not sound warm to you, but it was the practical choice. Easy to launder compared to wool, relatively smooth, against the skin and breathable. Over that, you might throw on an extra wool, tunic, or even a cloak, depending on the severity of the cold. To medieval minds, the more layers the better. But one detail stands out: the nightcap or coif. These were small cloth caps tied under the chin or simply pulled snugly over the head. Why such an emphasis on covering the skull? Because it was widely believed, quite sensibly, that most body heat escaped through the head. A medieval sleeper without a coif was like a knight without armor, dangerously exposed. Illuminated manuscripts even show figures tucked into bed with their heads neatly wrapped, looking more like they're ready for travel than for dreams. The nightshirt itself could vary in length. Poor families wore what they had, often their undertunic repurposed for sleeping. Wealthier nobles commissioned nightwear, embroidered with fine thread or edged in fur. Some ladies even had sleeping hoods that trailed with ribbons, though one suspects those were impractical in reality. Whatever the style, the principle was clear. Cover everything you could. A curious note from a 15th century medical text recommends that sleepers bind their feet in linen or wool against the night air. This wasn't mere fashion. It was early recognition that extremities froze first. People wrapped their toes, ankles, and even hands in strips of cloth before bed, creating makeshift socks and mittens. You can almost feel it. Your hands swaddled, your feet cocooned, every inch of skin shielded from the relentless cold. But what about debate? Scholars remain divided over how widely specialized sleep clothing existed, as opposed to simply reusing daytime garments. Some argue that for peasants there was no such thing as nightwear. People simply collapsed in whatever they wore during the day. Others point to wills and inventories that mention night linens, specifically suggesting that at least for the middle and upper classes, distinct sleep attire was normal. Both views hold truth depending on rank and region, but all agree that covering up at night was non-negotiable. Now picture yourself preparing for bed in this way. You strip off your heavier outer layers, slip into a long linen shirt, and tug a cap snugly over your ears. The air nips at your neck until you pull the blankets up. Every fiber of fabric adds a tiny layer of defense, and together they form a cocoon. The bed might be drafty, the room freezing, but at least your body has become a fortress of cloth. The sensory details are vivid. The linen is cool and faintly scratchy at first, warming as your skin heats it. The wool smells faintly of sheep and lanolin, earthy but reassuring. Your cap presses gently around your head, muting sound and making you feel enclosed. You wriggle into position, swaddled like a parcel, and wait for sleep to come. There was another reason for night clothes beyond warmth: modesty. In a world where bed sharing was common, being half-dressed or naked was unacceptable. Even married couples were often depicted in manuscripts wearing caps and long shirts in bed. It wasn't just about surviving the night, it was about propriety. And so whether you were a lord, a lady, a servant, or a soldier, your nightshirt and coif served a social function as much as a practical one. Think of the rhythm of such nights. The ritual of dressing not down but up, layering more cloth, tying knots, and smoothing wrinkles before extinguishing the light. In our modern sense, nightwear is associated with relaxation. For the medieval sleeper, it was armor against the elements. So, as you tug your own blanket tonight, think of those long-ago figures who climbed into bed looking more like travelers than dreamers, bundled in linen and wool, heads wrapped tightly against the dark. Their sleep was not effortless. It was engineered, stitch by stitch, layer by layer, against the endless siege of cold stone. Picture the moment before you slip under the covers. A servant steps forward, carrying a long-handled pan, its brass surface glowing faintly in the firelight. Inside, hot coals crackle and hiss, filling the chamber with the smell of ash and heated metal. This curious object was the medieval warming pan, a tool as simple as it was ingenious, because who wanted to crawl into sheets that felt like blocks of ice? The ritual went like this. The servant slid the pan back and forth between the bedclothes, the coals inside radiating heat through tiny perforations. The sheets above puffed with smoke, and the air filled with the faint tang of burning wood. For a few minutes, the bed transformed from a frozen slab into something almost inviting. Without this step, you might lie shivering for an hour before your own body heat finally softened the chill. Surviving inventories from noble households list warming pans alongside candlesticks and chamber pots, ordinary tools of nightly life. They weren't rare, they were expected. By the late Middle Ages, wealthy homes across Europe treated them as essential in winter. A chamber without one was either neglected or occupied by someone low enough in status not to merit the luxury. But these pans carried hazards too. Contemporary letters complain of sheets scorched black or even set ablaze when servants left the pan in one place too long. Imagine sliding into bed, only to discover a smoking hole where your linen should be. There are stories half comical, half tragic, of noble men springing from bed in the middle of the night because sparks from a warming pan had caught the blankets in a wooden, roofed chamber full of dry rushes. Such accidents were no small matter. One particularly odd account from Italy describes sprinkling aromatic herbs directly onto the coals before warming the bed. The smoke left behind was thought to purify the air and ward off disease. You can almost smell it now, lavender and rosemary, mingling with the sharp tang of embers clinging to the fabric as you finally climbed beneath it. The belief combined practicality with superstition. A nightly battle against both cold and invisible illnesses. Specialists in medieval domestic life still discuss how widespread warming pans truly were. Some argue they were confined mainly to high status households, too expensive and risky for common folk. Others counter that simpler versions such as clay pots filled with embers wrapped in cloth were common among middling families. The truth is elusive because such humble items rarely survived. What's clear, however, is that some method of preheating the bed existed across society, even if the form varied. Now, imagine yourself watching the process in your chamber. The servant draws the pan steadily across the sheets, steam rising, faintly as dampness evaporates. When the pan is withdrawn, the air under the covers is unexpectedly warm. almost startling after the bitter cold of the room. You slide inside quickly, trying to trap that heat before it escapes. For a few minutes, the cocoon feels blissful, as if you've stolen a pocket of summer in the heart of winter. But it doesn't last. The warmth fades rapidly, replaced once more by the relentless chill of the castle walls. The trick was never about keeping you comfortable all night. It was about making the first moments of sleep bearable. Once your body relaxed, once exhaustion overcame, the shivering, you were more likely to drift into slumber and let your own heat do the rest. The warming pan was a symbol of compromise. Never enough to solve the cold entirely, but enough to buy you a start. In a way, it was like striking a bargain with the night. Give me a few minutes of comfort, and I'll endure the rest. As you imagine yourself, lying there, drifting off, with the faint scent of embers still clinging to your sheets, you realize just how ritualized medieval sleep really was. Every evening involved a choreography of tools, garments, and gestures. The warming pan wasn't a luxury for show, it was part of the survival kit, and without it, many nights would have begun in misery rather than rest. You stir in your imagined bed, tugging the heavy blankets closer, when suddenly you feel a weight press against your legs. A warm, solid shape curls into the crook of your knees, sighs contentedly, and settles down for the night. It isn't another person. It's a dog, or perhaps two, maybe even three, if you were lucky. The practice of letting animals share the bed was far from unusual. Dogs especially were not just guardians of property or hunting companions. They were heaters. Their thick coats radiated warmth, and their loyalty meant they would stay near their masters through the long hours of the dark. A castle chamber that felt like an ice cave could become significantly more bearable with a few hounds snuggled up at your feet. Wills and household records from the later Middle Ages occasionally mentioned small lapdogs gifted to noble women, not only for companionship, but for warmth in bed. These comfort dogs, as we might call them now, were pampered creatures, brushed and perfumed. But their most important role was to chase away the chill of winter nights. Larger breeds, meanwhile, stretched out like furry logs across the bottom of the bed, protecting toes from frostbite. There is even a curious reference from Scandinavia describing how travellers in winter inns often requested to sleep in stalls with animals rather than in the unheated guest rooms. Horses, cattle, and sheep produce so much heat that sleeping near them was preferable to a lonely bed in stone. Imagine drifting off to the steady breathing of a cow beside you, the air heavy with the smell of hay, but your body warmed by the sheer heat of its bulk. Not glamorous, but effective. Dogs, however, carried a special intimacy. A medieval proverb in French claims that a faithful dog keeps the frost away from his master's heart. It's both literal and poetic. The animal's warmth sustained the body, while its presence soothed the spirit in lonely, draughty castles. Scholars remain divided on how universal this practice was. Some maintain that allowing animals in noble beds was frowned upon in formal households, relegated to private indulgence rather than open custom. Others argue the evidence suggests it was widespread, especially in rural or frontier castles, where survival mattered more than etiquette. The debate circles around whether the image of a lady sleeping with a lapdog is romantic exaggeration or practical truth. Now, picture the scene vividly. You lie swaddled in your linen nightshirt and wool blankets, the curtains of the bed drawn tight. Outside, the wind shrieks along the battlements. Your toes ache with cold until suddenly you feel the warmth of a hound pressed against them. Its fur is coarse, its body solid, and though it carries the scent of the hunt and the outdoors, you welcome it without hesitation. Another dog curls at your prime side, and soon you are cocooned, not just in cloth, but in living heat. The chamber may still be icy, but inside the bed, the world is transformed. Of course, This came with inconveniences. Dogs shed hair, dragged in dirt, and sometimes gnawed on bones hidden under the covers. Insects travelled with them, spreading to their human companions. And yet, the trade-off was worth it. Better fleas than frostbite. Better a dirty blanket than a night without sleep. The sensory mix is unforgettable. The earthy smell of dog fur, the faint smoke clinging to your clothes, the heavy press of blankets, and underneath it all the steady rhythm of another creature's breathing. It's no wonder people spoke of their animals with affection bordering on reverence. To share warmth was to share survival. The image of the three-dog night, though a phrase coined much later, captures the essence of medieval sleeping habits. One dog meant manageable cold, two meant serious chill, three meant the night was so bitter that even nobles stacked every possible source of heat into the bed. So, as you lie there in your own bed tonight, think of how extraordinary it must have felt for people in castles, isolated by stone, assaulted by draughts, surrounded by darkness, to draw strength and comfort from the simple loyalty of an animal curled by their side. In that small exchange of warmth, human and dog kept each other alive through countless winter nights. Pull the curtains back for a moment and step outside the noble chamber in your imagination. Across the courtyard in the shadowed servants' quarters, another world of sleep unfolds. The contrast between peasant and noble slumber was stark, and yet the outcome, survival through bitter nights, was the same goal. Who then truly slept? Warmer? The answer might surprise you. Nobles had grandeur, feather beds, fur, collets, warming pans, and thick canopies. But grandeur did not always mean comfort. Their bedchambers were cavernous, built for display as much as for rest, and all that space made them impossible to heat. Even with roaring fireplaces, the stones swallowed warmth like a sponge. So a lord might lie on heaps of down and fur, yet still breathe air that froze into mist before his eyes. Meanwhile, peasants lived in humbler houses of timber and daub, small enough that a single hearth warmed the entire interior. A thatched roof thick with straw acted as insulation. Families huddled together, often with animals, stabled at one end of the room, and the combined heat kept the air far more tolerable than in a draughty keep. A visitor to a 14th century English village wrote with mild astonishment that though the huts were mean, they held warmth far better than the Lord's Tower. And yet status determined more than comfort. Nobles had access to finer materials, wool of high quality, imported furs, linen that softened with washing. Peasants made do with coarse, woolen blankets patched until they thinned, or sheepskins cured roughly in smokehouses. Their bedding smelled strongly of lanolin and hearth smoke, and though it insulated well, it never looked or felt luxurious. One curious note from memorial records shows that peasants sometimes slept directly on benches near the fire, their children curled in their laps. They risked sparks and smoke, but the closeness to the hearth guaranteed warmth. In contrast, the noble's bedchamber, separated from the great hall, often lacked that immediate heat. Comfort was thus unevenly distributed, not always in the way you'd expect. Researchers today still puzzle over the real hierarchy of warmth. Did wealth automatically buy you better sleep, or did peasants, in their cramped but snug cottages, manage to endure the winter nights more easily? Evidence points both ways. Some scholars argue that nobles' sheer volume of textiles kept them superior. Others insist the smaller communal spaces of the lower classes offered practical warmth that the aristocracy's grandeur could not match. The discussion remains unresolved, highlighting how much sleep itself mirrored social divisions. Imagine now the two scenes side by side. In the castle, a nobleman shifts beneath heavy layers, his breath curling white, the vast room echoing with every gust of wind against the shutters. Down in the village, a peasant family squeezes onto a straw mattress before the hearth. Children nestled like kittens, the smell of animals drifting from the stall nearby. One bed is ornate and stiffly formal, the other crowded and earthy. But which body wakes warmer? The question lingers, and perhaps no one answer fits all cases. Still, both noble and peasant shared one truth. They adapted. Survival, in the medieval night, was not about absolute comfort, but about learning to live with hardship, reshaping homes and habits until rest became possible. Nobles may have flaunted luxury, peasants may have relied on closeness and simplicity, but all slept under the same winter stars, shivering and dreaming their way toward morning. As you drift in your own warm bed tonight, you can sense the irony. Status determined the trappings, but not always the quality of medieval sleep. Sometimes the humblest hut held more genuine warmth than the grandest hall. You might think that once a bed was established in a noble chamber, it never moved. After all, these beds were massive objects, heavy with carved posts and curtains. But in practice, families often shifted where they slept according to the season. Bedrooms were not fixed, timeless sanctuaries. They were flexible, spaces chosen for their relationship to sunlight, fire, and wind. In other words, you chased the sun in winter and fled it in summer. Documents from noble estates reveal this habit plainly. Some castles had winter chambers and summer chambers, not because people wanted a change of scenery, but because the physics of warmth demanded it. In cold months, families moved into rooms with southern exposure, where the weak sun struck through the windows for a few precious hours each day. The walls there stored a little more heat. The air felt a little less hostile, and waking up wasn't quite so brutal. Come summer, they abandoned those sunlit spaces and retreated into north-facing rooms, darker and cooler. There is a well-documented example in the accounts of Edward IV's household, where entire beds and furnishings were moved seasonally. Servants carried feather beds, linens, and tapestries from one chamber to another, creating temporary nests wherever the king chose to rest. It was a logistical ordeal, but for those living in stone palaces, mobility was essential to survive. A curious note survives from a Biandian courtier who complained in a letter that he lost his chamber to the frost one year. The walls, he said, grew so damp and cold that he refused to sleep there, choosing instead a narrower room facing the rising Sunday. His phrasing reminds us that, in castles, the building itself was an adversary. Rooms were conquered by cold, surrendered, and retaken with the seasons. Archaeologists and architectural historians still debate whether every castle truly offered multiple seasonal chambers, or whether this was a luxury of the grandest estates. Some argue that the majority of castles had only a few suitable rooms for sleeping, forcing residents to endure the cold where they were. Others insist that evidence of window placements, fireplaces, and surviving records shows intentional design for seasonal living. The argument remains unresolved, but the image is persuasive. A noble family migrating within its own walls like birds shifting nests as the weather turned. Now imagine yourself following this routine. In autumn you begin to eye the sunlit side of the keep, knowing that soon the long nights will demand every advantage. Servants, dismantle your bed, hauling frame, mattress, and hangings piece by piece. The sound of carpenters adjusting posts echoes in the new chamber, while tapestries are hammered into place to block drafts. By the time the first frost comes, you are tucked into a room that at least greets you with pale shafts of morning light. The sensory detail is vivid. You wake to the thin warmth of the sun filtering through shutters, the smell of woolen curtains freshly rehung, and the faint sound of servants sweeping rushes across the floor of your relocated chamber. The shift does not eliminate the cold. It simply manages it, turning unbearable into survivable. Peasants too shifted, their sleeping spaces seasonally, though less formally. Families might sleep close to the hearth in winter, crowding around the fire in one room, and then retreat to lofts or barns in summer. where the air was cooler. In both castles and cottages, sleep was mobile, dictated by the elements rather than interior design. This practice reminds you that medieval life had little of our modern notion of fixed bedrooms. A bedroom wasn't a permanent sacred space. It was a temporary camp within the larger fortress of stone. Beds were moved, chambers rotated, and life adapted in rhythm with the seasons. The castle was alive, reshaped by light and temperature, its inhabitants shifting like nomads within its walls. And so you see another truth of medieval sleep. It was dynamic, not static. The fight against cold demanded movement, planning, and constant adjustment. You did not sleep where you wanted. You slept where the sun, the wind, and the damp permitted. And each year, as the earth turned, you began that cycle again. Stand for a moment by the narrow window of a medieval chamber and feel the draft slip across your skin. Unlike today's homes with their glass panes and sealed frames, castle windows were vulnerable holes in the wall. They were defenses against arrows but invitations to the wind. Without glass, without double glazing, without even the notion of insulation, these openings were simply shutters or stretched cloth that kept out little more than rain and birds. Written surveys of medieval households reveal that in many castles, the glass was so rare it was reserved for chapels or the lord's private oratory. Ordinary chambers had wooden shutters, thick planks that could be barred from the inside. In summer they stood open, for light and air, but in winter they shut tight, creaking in the wind. Yet, wood alone was no shield against the chill. Cold crept through cracks, and the room grew damp. A practical solution was to stretch cloth across the opening, sometimes linen soaked in oil or wax, to make it translucent and resistant to rain. By day, this allowed a dim amber glow to enter, soft and hazy like sunlight through parchment. By night, it dulled the shriek of the wind, but never silenced it. The fabric flapped, the frame rattled, and sleepers learned to live with the constant reminder that their fortress was porous. One intriguing reference comes from a 13th century French household account describing horn windows. Thin slices of .com animal horn were scraped translucent and set into wooden frames. These provided a crude but sturdier alternative to cloth. They admitted pale light and resisted weather better, though they yellowed quickly and warped. Imagine looking out through such panes, the world blurred as if seen through fogged glass. Yet inside your chamber, the air just a fraction less brutal. Archaeologists and architectural historians debate how common these horn or oiled cloth windows really were. Some argue they were luxuries of the wealthiest castles, while most households relied only on shutters. Others suggest that by the later Middle Ages, they were surprisingly widespread in Northern Europe. The evidence is fragmentarian, but the very existence of debate reminds us how desperate people were to improvise barriers between themselves and the cold. Now picture yourself at such a window. The shutter is drawn, the cloth tacked across the frame, and still a sharp line of frost forms along the sill. Your breath clouds as you lean near it. Outside, the snow reflects the moon. But inside, you hear the faint rattle of wood and the moan of wind searching to a gap. No matter how carefully you hang your bed curtains, you know the draft will find its way to you. The soundscape is haunting. Shutters banging in a distant corridor. Fabric snapping faintly like sails. Servants muttering as they stuff rags into cracks. Some households even pressed moss or clay into gaps around the frames as makeshift insulation. It was messy, unsightly, and temporary. But when the night dipped below freezing, any measure was better than none. Peasants in cottages faced the same battle. Their houses often had no windows at all, just shutters to close off narrow slits. Some used bladder membranes from animals, stretched thin to let in light. The effect was eerie. Rooms glowed faintly, but with distorted shadows, as if the world outside were behind a veil. At night, though, even these coverings hardened with frost, turning translucent sheets into brittle ice. For nobles, the irony was bitter. Their high towers gave them status and defense, but also exposed them to cutting winds. Guests sometimes remarked that the higher they slept, the colder they felt. A peasant in his low hut might envy the wealth of a lord, but not the draught whistling through a tower chamber window. And yet, there was beauty too. Imagine lying in bed on a moonlit night. The shutters cracked just enough to let silver light wash across the floor. The cold seeped in. Yes, poetry of shadows. The silhouette of branches against the curtain. The faint glow of snow outside. Medieval sleep was a balance of discomfort and wonder, where the harshest nights also offered moments of fragile peace. So when you draw your own curtains tonight, picture those ancient windows. They were less barriers than reminders that no matter how thick the walls, the night always found its way in. Sleep was never about conquering the cold entirely. It was about learning to live with it, draught after draught, until morning broke. You picture yourself approaching the hearth of a castle bedchamber, expecting salvation in the blaze. Surely a fire in a stone room must mean warmth. But the reality is far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces were enormous, their chimneys yawning wide enough that entire trees could be fed into them. Yet for all their spectacle, they were poor at actually heating the space. The reason was simple: physics. The wider the chimney, the more heat escaped directly upward with the smoke. Flames roared, sparks danced, logs collapsed into glowing embers, and yet step more than a few paces away, and your breath still misted in the air. The fire created a bright oasis of heat in its immediate circle. But beyond that, the castle chamber remained bitterly cold. Household records emphasize how much wood this demanded. A single winter, week in a large castle might consume entire wagon loads of timber. Forest management became a constant concern, not just for construction, but for fuel. One lord in France complained bitterly in his letters that keeping his great hall warm had emptied the woods faster than any war. Fires devoured resources, yet rarely provided the comfort one imagined. There are amusing accounts too. Guests sometimes joked that noble fireplaces were big enough to roast an ox, but too weak to warm a man. The exaggeration rings true. These hearths provided spectacle, light, and a sense of majesty, but little real relief against the unrelenting chill of stone walls. Some households experimented with placing iron firebacks behind the flames, reflecting heat into the room. Others lined hearths with tiles to store warmth a little longer. But these measures were partial solutions, tinkering against a problem too large to conquer fully. A blazing fire might keep your feet warm if you sat right in front of it, but your back remained icy, and your bed across the room might as well have been outdoors. Scholars still dispute how effective castle fireplaces truly were. Some argue they provided meaningful warmth when combined with hangings and heavy furniture, creating a layered system of heat retention. Others contend they were almost symbolic, more about status and ritual than comfort, since most of the energy vanished up the chimney. The truth likely varied from castle to castle, depending on resources, design, and climate. Now imagine yourself in such a room. The fire crackles loudly, spitting sparks onto the hearthstones. Smoke curls upward, leaving a faint tang in the air. Your face feels flushed, prickling with warmth, but your shoulders remain cold. You shuffle closer, holding out your hands until you nearly singe your sleeves. Then reluctantly, you retreat to your bed across the chamber, only to find the temperature drops with every step. By the time you slip under the blankets, you may as well have been sitting outside. Peasants, by contrast, often benefited more from their smaller hearths. A single central fire in a modest cottage heated the whole interior, smoky though it was. The cramped space meant that flames and bodies together maintained tolerable warmth. The grand, noble fireplaces, by contrast, burned through resources but left chambers half frozen. Grandeur once again failed to translate into comfort. And yet the ritual of the fire mattered. It wasn't just about heat. It was about gathering, about light, about the reassurance that at least something pushed back against the darkness. People prayed by the fire, shared stories by it, dozed in chairs beside it. Even when the warmth didn't carry across the room, the glow offered psychological safety, a beacon of life in the cavernous cold. So when you imagine a medieval night, don't think of a roaring fireplace saving you from frost. Think instead of a fragile island of heat in a sea of icy air, comfort that lasted only as long as you stayed near, and comfort that disappeared the moment you climbed into bed. The hearth was a performance as much as a practical tool, and the medieval sleeper learned to be grateful for what little it could give. You lean closer to that glowing fireplace, and for a fleeting moment it feels safe. But then another reality of medieval life asserts itself. Smoke. Fireplaces were not clean, efficient machines. They belched fumes, left soot, and filled chambers with a haze that stung the eyes and settled on every surface. To stay warm by fire was to breathe smoke nightly, to accept blackened walls, and to wake with lungs coated in ash. Chroniclers of the time complained bitterly about it. One monk, in northern England, noted that his cell grew so coated with soot from the hearth that he coughed more than he prayed. Even nobles weren't immune. Court records mention women lamenting ruined gowns and linens discoloured by constant smoke exposure. A newly cleaned tapestry might turn grey within a single winter. The architecture made matters worse. Chimneys were wide, crude shafts without the draft control of modern flue. Smoke didn't always rise politely. It drifted, eddied, and clung to the chamber. If the wind blew the wrong direction, it poured back into the room, leaving everyone inside coughing. Imagine trying to fall asleep while smoke burned your throat and your eyes watered. A curious observation from travellers' notes is that some people deliberately smeared their walls with lime or clay, not only to brighten interiors, but to hide the streaks of soot. The black residue never truly left, but at least the illusion of cleanliness could be restored for a little while. The smell, however, was permanent, a mixture of charred wood, damp stone, and burned wool that clung to bedding and clothes. Scholars remain divided over just how tolerable these smoky rooms were. Some argue that medieval people simply adapted. Their bodies and expectations hardened to it. Others insist that even contemporaries recognize the health toll, pointing to repeated complaints in medical treatises about choked air and blackened lungs. Perhaps both are true. People endured because they had no choice, but they never stopped grumbling about it. Now, imagine yourself lying in bed after such a night. Your hair smells of smoke. Your blankets hold the acrid tang of ash. And when you cough, you taste bitterness on your tongue. The bed curtains trap some of it inside. So even your tiny cocoon carries the ghost of the fire. Your chamber may have been warmer than before, but it came at the cost of fresh air. Peasants fared no better. Their cottages often lacked chimneys altogether. Smoke from the central hearth simply rose and filled the rafters, slowly leaking through the thatch. Children grew up in houses perpetually hazed with smoke. Their lungs blackened before adulthood, yet people saw it as normal. Some even believed the smoke helped preserve the timber roof, keeping insects away. Survival and superstition blended together in every breath. The sensory experience was overwhelming. Your skin prickled from soot particles. Your eyes watered constantly, and the rushes on the floor gathered black dust. Servants swept endlessly, though the effort felt futile. Every winter was the same. A battle against smoke, a battle against cold, and the knowledge that you couldn't win one without worsening the other. And yet, despite the discomfort, the fire was non-negotiable. No one could survive a castle winter without it. So people made their peace. They hung smoky tapestries proudly. They endured coughing fits. They scrubbed soot from their faces each morning. Warmth demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice was clean air. So as you lie in your modern bed tonight, breathing comfortably without thought, consider how extraordinary such luxury island for medieval sleepers. Every warm night meant another smoky morning. There, dreams were steeped in the scent of burning wood. Their lives lived in the shadow of soot. When the fire dimmed and the night stretched on, the only glow left in a medieval chamber often came from a candle. You might imagine this delicate flame as decoration, a touch of ambiance. But for many sleepers, the candle was also a source of fragile warmth. A single wick couldn't heat a whole room, of course. But in a world where every flicker counted, even the faintest contribution mattered. Candles in the Middle Ages came in many forms. Wealthy households burned beeswax, which gave a clean, bright flame and filled the air with a faint honeyed scent. These were expensive, reserved for chapels, ceremonies, or noble chambers. More commonly, people used tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. These smoked, sputtered, and wire of grease. Imagine drifting off to sleep while the acrid odour of burning tallow thickened the air, mingling with the damp of stone and the musk of wool. Yet candles weren't only light. They generated a surprising amount of heat close by. Place one near your bed curtain, and you might notice the fabric warming slightly to the touch. Some households arranged several candles together on stands, creating clusters of flames that offered both illumination and a pocket of warmth. It was hardly central heating, but it softened the edge of the cold in the immediate circle around them. A curious anecdote survives from a 14th century letter describing how a noble woman demanded 12 candles in her chamber at once on winter nights, insisting that only then could she rest. The servants grumbled at the extravagance, but her request reveals a truth. People used light as a substitute heater, even when the effect was marginal. The hazards were obvious. Candle flames toppled easily, and bed curtains rich with wool and linen were dangerously flammable. Records describe fires sparked by careless placement, reducing entire chambers to cinders. One particularly grim tale from Germany tells of a squire who dozed off with a candle on the bed rail. He awoke to find his blankets aflame and barely escaped with his life. The servants blamed him for recklessness, but the real culprit was necessity. He had wanted a sliver of warmth too close at hand. Scholars still discuss whether medieval people understood the dangers fully, or whether the routine use of candles bred complacency. Some argue that inventories of charred textiles show that accidents were common, but accepted. Others believe the wealthy minimized risk by assigning servants to monitor the lights deep into the night. Whatever the case, the balance between danger and comfort was constant. Now, picture yourself in such a chamber. The fire in the hearth has dwindled to embers, leaving only shadows crawling up the walls. A single candle burns on a wooden stand near your bed. Its glow is soft and golden, casting a halo that reaches your hands as you pull the covers tighter. The faint warmth radiates just enough that your face feels less icy. The flame flickers, wax, drips steadily down the side, and the smell of smoke hangs faintly in the air. Outside your curtain, the rest of the room vanishes into darkness. You listen to the subtle sounds, the quiet pop of the wick, the sigh of wind against the shutters, the soft drip of wax landing on metal. Your world shrinks to this small circle of light and heat. The candle becomes not just illumination, but companionship, a fragile ally against the enormity of the night. In cottages and inns, simpler versions of this scene played out. Travellers placed rush lights, cheap reeds dipped in fat beside their straw pallets. These burned quickly and unevenly, hissing and spitting, but their faint glow provided reassurance. Parents lit small lamps near children to chase away both cold and fear. Even monks who prized austerity allowed lamps to burn in dormitories, citing both safety and necessity. The sensory mixture was unforgettable. The air smelled of melted fat and smoke. The walls stray with soot from months of burning. The bedclothes stained where wax had splattered. Yet people accepted these imperfections. In the harshest winter, the candle was more than decoration. It was survival. So as you drift under your own clean electric light tonight, imagine the precarious flicker of a medieval flame. It warmed just enough to trick the body into rest, and it risked disaster with every spark. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never free from tension, even in the smallest details. To close your eyes was to trust that your fragile flame would burn through the night without turning warmth into ruin. If you step away from noble chambers and into communal quarters, you find another side of medieval sleep, the collective dormitory. Not everyone had the privilege of heavy curtains, feather beds, and private servants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and servants often slept in shared spaces where the emphasis was less on luxury and more on endurance. Take the monastery as an example. Monastic rules prescribed that brothers live simply, which meant their dormitories were vast halls lined with rows of beds or pallets. The stone floor stretched endlessly, broken only by narrow windows high above. Each monk had his own small cot or straw mattress, sometimes little more than a wooden plank with a thin pad. The beds were positioned side by side, so close that one monk could hear the breathing of the next. Privacy was unknown, but warmth came from numbers. Surviving accounts describe how these halls echoed at night with coughing, snoring, and the rustle of rough woolen blankets. The air was thick, cold, and damp, but the sheer press of bodies meant the dormitory retained more warmth than an isolated chamber ever could. One chronicler remarked that the cloister was warmer than the Lord's Tower, for the monks lay together like shave. In military life, the scene was harsher still. Soldiers billeted in castles or campaign encampments crowded into barrack halls. Long rows of men stretched across straw beds, weapons stacked nearby. Blankets were shared, and cloaks doubled as cover. The smell was pungent sweat, leather, smoke, and straw mingling in a stew of humanity. Yet for the exhausted, even this rough camaraderie became bearable. To sleep shoulder to shoulder was to survive the night. A curious observation appears in the rules of certain nightly orders. Candles were kept burning in communal halls, not only for light, but to comfort the men with flame. The glow gave a psychological warmth, even if it failed to raise the temperature significantly. The symbolism of the flame mattered as much as its heat. Historians continue to debate whether communal sleeping was deliberately chosen for warmth or simply a byproduct of necessity. Some argue that the monasteries intended it as a form of discipline, a constant reminder that no monk had personal luxury. Others suggest the warmth of shared space was a practical advantage that just happened to align with spiritual ideals. The same ambiguity surrounds soldiers. Did they bunk together out of camaraderie, or because the cold made solitude impossible? Likely it was both. Now, imagine yourself lying in one of these halls. The straw beneath you crackles as you shift. A neighbour coughs. Another turns. The sound amplified by the vaulted ceiling. The smell of smoke and sweat hangs heavy, but the air is less biting than in a solitary chamber. Your wool blanket scratches your chin, and you tuck it tighter, grateful for the shared warmth, even as you wish for silence. The rhythm of the dormitory is unmistakable. Snores rise and fall like waves, punctuated by the occasional murmur of a dream. Somewhere a rat scurries across the rushes, ignored by men too weary to care. The draft still seeps in through the high windows, but the collective body heat dulls its edge. You may not feel cozy, but you feel safe. safer than you would alone in a vast, echoing stone room. Apprentices and household servants lived similarly. Castles were filled with side chambers and lofts where young boys or maids rolled out straw pallets, sometimes beneath staircases or in storerooms. They layered cloaks and huddled, together, turning humble corners into makeshift bedrooms. Unlike nobles, they could not command warming pans or feather beds, but they had the advantage of proximity. Their sleeping quarters were smaller, more crowded, and therefore warmer. The sensory experience of these communal spaces was unforgettable. Rough wool against skin, the musky odour of bodies pressed close, the low hum of breathing, the scratch of straw, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. It was not peace in the modern sense, but it was endurance. People did not expect silence or solitude. They expected survival. So tonight, as you rest in your own bed, think of those long halls of monks chanting prayers before extinguishing the lights, of soldiers collapsing in rows after battle, of servants curling together in hidden corners. Their warmth came not from silk or fur, but from each other. Sleep in medieval times was as much about community as about comfort. A reminder that even in the coldest castles, survival was rarely a solitary act. You've settled into this crowded dormitory in your imagination. But even here, warmth isn't guaranteed. Fires must be tended, and in the middle of the night, someone always had to get up, stumble across the floor, and stoke the embers. Medieval sleep was rarely uninterrupted. People woke frequently, not just from the discomfort of straw or the coughs of neighbours, but from the practical necessity of keeping the fire alive. The medieval body clock was different from ours. People didn't expect a straight 8 hours of rest. Instead, they lived with what some scholars call segmented sleep. A first, sleep came after dusk, lasting a few hours until midnight or so. Then many awoke, sometimes to tend fires, sometimes to pray, sometimes to check animals or children. After an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, they returned to a second sleep until dawn. In the freezing months, this break often revolved around fire maintenance. Without it, embers died and chambers became unbearable. One well-known record comes from the writings of a 15th century physician who recommended using the interval between first and second sleep for reflection, conversation, or even intimacy. To him, this waking period was natural, but to the castle servant trudging across icy floors to feed logs into a hearth, it was less philosophy and more duty. He heard the crackle of fresh wood, blew into the embers, and prayed they would catch. A curious custom appears in some rural accounts. Families assigned watch duties, especially in large halls. Each adult took turns rising to check the fire. In monasteries, bells rang at intervals through the night, calling monks to prayer, and coincidentally ensuring someone was always awake to mind the heat. Sleep was not a private withdrawal from the world, but a shared rhythm punctuated by responsibility. Historians debate whether segmented sleep was universal or more common in Northern Europe, where winter nights stretched long. Some argue it was dictated by necessity. The length of darkness simply made a single stretch of sleep impractical. Others suggest it was cultural habit, not entirely dependent on geography. The debate continues. But what remains clear is that tending the rosca, fire was at the heart of these nighttime rhythms. Imagine yourself waking in the dead of night. The room is silent, but for snores. You push back the blanket, feel the icy slap of air against your skin, and fumble for a log. Your feet crunch on straw. Your breath rises in plumes, and your hands sting as you stir the dying embers. Sparks flare, logs catch reluctantly, and warmth pulses again into the room. You sigh with relief, knowing that for a few more hours your companions will rest undisturbed. The sensory detail is unforgettable. The pop of wood, the faint glow pushing shadows back, the smell of smoke mingling with wool. Your fingers ache, but the satisfaction of reviving the fire steadies you when you crawl back beneath the blankets. The bed feels all the warmer. By contrast, peasants in cottages lived by the same rhythm. Their hearths had no protective grates, only open flames on the floor. So a careless sleeper risked the fire, dying or worse, spreading. A family member always rose to adjust logs, poke embers, and keep watch. Sleep came in, fits and starts, always tied to the heartbeat of the fire. And so you realize that medieval nights were not passive stretches of unconsciousness. They were negotiated, managed, and guarded. People rose, worked, prayed, checked on animals, whispered to loved ones, and then returned to slumber. In the darkness, life did not pause. It simply slowed, punctuated by firelight and breath. As you lie in your warm bed, tonight, imagine the constant vigilance required in those stone halls. To close, your eyes was never absolute. To sleep was to trust that someone would wake, feed the fire, and keep the cold from claiming the room before dawn. You've tended the fire, crawled back beneath the blankets, and tried to steal your racing thoughts. Yet there was another medieval strategy for warmth, not born of practicality, but of longing for luxury. For some, the dream of a hot bath before bed lingered like a forbidden indulgence. Bathing was complicated in the Middle Ages. Heating, water required immense fuel, and tubs were large, cumbersome things. A warm soak was far from an everyday habit. It was a special event, and often communal, but for those who could afford it, slipping into steaming water on a winter night was a kind of magic. Chroniclers described noble women lowering themselves into wooden tubs lined with cloth, steam curling up in the moating. Lamplight, attendants standing by with warmed towels. To step out of such a bath and then slide between sheets was to feel briefly that winter had lost. A curious record from Paris notes that wealthy citizens sometimes ordered tubs placed near fireplaces so that the bather emerged into a chamber already glowing with heat. The air smelled of rosemary or thyme, herbs tossed into the peopled, water for fragrance, and supposed medicinal benefit. For a short while, skin prickled with warmth, cheeks flushed, and the body felt prepared for restful sleep. Of course, such pleasures were rare. More often, people sought smaller comforts before bed. A cup of warm ale, spiced wine, or hot mead was a common indulgence. The heat travelled inward, spreading warmth through the chest, lulling the body toward drowsiness. Some households kept stones near the hearth, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them at the foot of the bed, primitive hot water bottles that radiated heat for hours. One rather odd account tells of noble families filling leather pouches with heated sand to tuck between sheets. The sand retained warmth, longer than stones, and conformed to the body's shape. Imagine stretching your frozen feet towards such a pouch, sighing as the cold slowly eased. The ingenuity is striking. When faced with hostile winters, people experimented with whatever materials they had. Modern historians still argue over just how common such bedtime luxuries were. Were they occasional treats for the very richest, or did middling families also practice them in modest form? Some suggest that warming drinks and heated stones were widespread, accessible to most households. Others believe they remained rare indulgences, remembered precisely because they were unusual. The debate reminds us that comfort itself was a contested privilege. Picture yourself in this imagined chamber. You sit before the hearth as a servant pours mulled wine into a cup. The scent of cinnamon and cloves fills the air, masking the odour of smoke and damp wool. You sip slowly, warmth blooming through your chest. Your eyes grow heavy. Your limbs loosen. And when you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more inviting. At the foot of the bed, A stone wrapped in cloth radiates faint heat against your toes. For once, you do not dread the night. The sensory impressions are vivid. The sweet tang of spiced wine, the hiss of a log collapsing into embers, the prickling warmth of heated stone. You drift into slumber with your senses saturated, your body convinced, however, briefly, that comfort is possible. But here's the truth. Such indulgences were fragile. Heat faded quickly, drinks cooled, and by midnight, the chamber was cold again. What these rituals offered was not permanent relief, but a kind of psychological grace moments of ease that made the endless chill tolerable. So as you rest tonight, think of how deeply medieval people yearned for warmth. They engineered clever tools, sought fleeting indulgences, and transformed even a hot drink into a strategy for survival. Their nights were not effortless, but they were resourceful. And every bath, every stone, every sip of ale was a 2-3, small rebellion against the cold. Even after baths, heated stones or mulled drinks, medieval people never relied on practical measures alone. Cold was not just a physical enemy. It was a spiritual and supernatural one too. Night was dangerous. The air itself suspected of harboring illness and malevolent forces. And so, people turned to charms, rituals, and superstitions to guard them as they slept. One commonly recorded practice was hanging amulets above the bed. These might be simple crosses carved from wood, small relics said to contain saintly power, or even herbs bound in little pouches. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were popular choices, believed to drive away not only evil spirits, but also the night air, thought to be poisonous. Imagine lying in bed beneath a canopy strung with fragrant bundles, the scent mingling with the smoke of the hearth and the musk of wool blankets. Prayers were another shield. Monastic rules encouraged reciting psalms before lying down, and noble families often repeated paternisters or amaras at the bedside. But even peasants whispered charms, half prayer, half spell, as they crossed themselves against frost or fever. Some murmured verses over children, pressing kisses on their foreheads to keep the night hag away. A figure blamed for suffocating sleepers. A curious detail appears in a German household manual from the 15th century. Sleepers were advised to place iron objects such as a knife or scissors beneath the bed or pillow. Iron was thought to repel demons and fairies that slipped into rooms during the long hours of darkness. The metal glinted faintly in the firelight, a silent guard against unseen intruders. And then there were rituals tied directly to warmth. One folk belief insisted that turning your shoes upside down beside the bed would keep frost from biting your toes. Another claimed that if you whispered the names of 3 saints before blowing out the candle, your body heat would not flee in the night. To us, these sound like quaint superstitions. To them they were strategies as vital as an extra blanket. Scholars remain divided on how seriously people took such practices. Some argue that charms and prayers were heartfelt, deeply ingrained in the rhythm of daily life. Others suggest they were more like habits, gestures performed out of custom, even if not fully believed. Either way, the rituals reveal something essential. Sleep was never trusted. It was a vulnerable state where cold, illness, and spirits could all strike. People needed both physical and spiritual defenses. Picture yourself lying in a medieval bed now. The curtains are drawn, the fire is low, and the chamber is filled with shadows. Above you hangs a sprig of juniper, its sharp scent cutting through the smoky air. Beneath your pillow rests a small iron knife, hidden but comforting. You whisper a prayer, words soft and rhythmic, and then cross yourself before pulling the blankets tighter. The night feels less menacing, as though the plastron rituals have carved a circle of safety around your fragile body. The sensory details deepen the experience. The rustle of herbs brushing against the canopy, the faint metallic smell of iron near your head, the warmth of wool against your skin, and the lingering echo of whispered words. In that moment, faith, superstition, and survival are all intertwined. Peasants practiced the same, though with different materials. Instead of relics, they hung crude charms, carved wooden figures, knotted cords, or simple herbs gathered from fields. Parents tucked garlic under children's pillows, believing it warded off both sickness and spirits. Even animals were included, cows and sheep in seas. Buyers were sometimes blessed before nightfall, their presence thought to strengthen the household against frost. In every class of society, the cold night was not just endured with cloth and fire, but with ritual. The medieval mind sought warmth in the body and safety in the unseen. To sleep was to step into mystery, where prayer and herb, iron and flame all work together against the long darkness. So when you tuck yourself into tonight, imagine those little gestures. The flipped shoes, the sprig of rosemary, the whispered saint's name. They were small, comforts, no less real for being intangible. For the medieval sleeper, survival was never purely physical. It was also spiritual armor, woven from faith, habit, and hope. Step back from the bed itself and look at the chamber as a whole. Beyond blankets, dogs, or charms, the architecture of a room shaped how well its occupants could endure the night. Castles were built first for defense, but over time, builders experimented with ways to make the interiors more livable. The result was a patchwork of features, some clever, some symbolic, that aimed to carve warmth out of stone. One such feature was the solar, a private room often set aside for the lord and his family. Unlike the cavernous great hall, the solar was smaller, higher in the building, and easier to heat. It usually had its own fireplace, thick hangings on the walls and windows facing the Sunday. This wasn't luxury in the modern sense. It was strategy. By reducing the size of the room, the fire's heat had a fighting chance of lingering. Tapestries became more than decoration, woven from wool or silk. They lined the walls with colour and stories. Saints, hunts, mythical beasts. But they also served as insulation. A tapestry might be 10 or 20 feet wide, heavy enough that servants struggled to hang it. Behind it, the damp stone was hidden, and the air near the wall grew a little less icy. Step close to one, and you could even smell the lanolin of the wool, earthy and faintly comforting. Archaeological surveys show that many chambers had wooden panelling installed for the same reason. Oak boards created a buffer zone, trapping pockets of air and making the space feel less like a cave. Servants stuffed gaps with tow, moss, or rags to stop drafts. The result was imperfect, but it demonstrated the lengths people went to transform inhospitable fortresses into homes. A curious detail emerges in estate accounts. Nobles often moved their most prized tapestries from castle to castle, carrying them like portable walls. They weren't just art, they were survival gear. A lord travelling without his hangings was like a soldier without armour. Specialists in medieval domestic life still argue over just how effective these architectural features were. Some believe they genuinely reduced drafts and retained heat. Others insist the psychological comfort mattered more than the physical difference. Walking into a chamber hung with brilliant cloth and glowing with firelight might feel warmer, even if the actual temperature barely changed. That debate underscores the subtle interplay between perception and survival. Now picture yourself stepping into such a room. The door closes behind you, muting the howl of the wind from the corridor. The walls are draped with crimson and gold tapestries, their woven figures half-lit by candlelight. The fire flickers in a carved stone hearth, smoke twisting upward. Above you, the timber ceiling seems lower than in the great hall, the space more intimate. It is still cold. You see your breath in the air, but less hostile than the open chambers below. The sensory impression is layered, the rough weave of tapestry beneath your hand, the faint smell of wool mixed with smoke, the sound of fire snapping against oak logs. You can almost believe this room is a refuge, though the cold lurks just beyond the hangings. Peasants mimicked the same strategy in simpler form. Instead of woven tapestries, they plastered or waddle lined their walls, then hung coarse wool or patched cloth to reduce drafts. A brightly painted cloth with simple patterns might double as insulation and decoration. In their way, peasants also turned bare walls into protective shells, shrinking the space into something habitable. Another subtle architectural trick was the placement of sleeping chambers on upper floors. Rising heat from the great hall below gave at least a slight advantage. Children sometimes slept in lofts above, kitchens, where warmth from ovens lingered. The arrangement was less about privacy and more about exploiting every stray degree of heat. And yet, despite all these efforts, the cold never vanished. You could only mitigate, never eliminate its grip. Still, the presence of wall hangings, solar chambers, and wooden panels shows how profoundly people long to transform stone prisons into dwellings. So as you rest tonight, imagine those rooms glowing with tapestries, warmed faintly by fires, softened by wooden boards and bright cloth. They were not cozy by our standards, but they were gestures of defiance. Against the stone, against the frost, against the endless winter night, the medieval household built layers, architectural, artistic, and psychological, to say, this space is ours, and here, at least, we will endure. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of a medieval bedroom. It wasn't the lavender-scented idyll of modern linen adverts. Instead, it was a dense stew of odour layered from the moment you walked through the heavy wooden door. To understand how people slept, you have to understand what they smelled, because every breath reminded them of the conditions in which they lived. The first scent was always smoke. Fires burned almost constantly in winter, and without efficient chimneys, the soot drifted back into the room. The walls darkened, the air grew heavy, and the smell embedded itself in the very fibres of blankets and curtains. Even freshly laundered linen soon carried the tang of ash. You'd lie down at night with smoke clinging to your hair, your clothes, even your skin. Next came the scent of damp wool. Blankets, cloaks, and clothing were rarely truly dry in winter. Moisture crept through stone walls, condensed on surfaces, and soaked into textiles. Wool holds that damp smell, stubbornly earthy, lanolin rich, faintly sour. Imagine pulling the covers up to your chin and inhaling fabric that felt warm but never quite fresh. Add to this the odour of straw and rushes. Floors were covered with them, beds stuffed with them, and they rarely stayed clean, trampled by boots, soaked with spills, and colonized by mice. Rushes turned musty quickly. Straw mattresses released grassy scents at first, but after weeks of use, they reek of sweat and decay. Each shift in bed released another puff of that earthy smell into the air. One curious note in a 14th century household manual recommended sprinkling dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, or meadow, onto rushes to sweeten the chamber. For a few days it worked. The fragrance mingled with the heavier odour, masking them just enough to seem civilized. But soon the herbs wilted, crushed beneath feet, their scent fading into the background, while the sourness of old rushes returned. Then there was the human smell. Hygiene was limited. Baths infrequent and sweat constant. People slept in layers of clothing that absorbed the day's odour. Leather, wool, unwashed skin. Beds shared by families or companions compounded this. Breathing. The air of a medieval chamber meant inhaling the scent of other bodies, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Scholars debate just how overwhelming these smells truly were. Some argue that medieval people, accustomed to constant exposure, barely noticed. Others believe contemporaries were very much aware, which is why they valued herbs, perfumes, and incense so highly. Evidence from inventories and medical texts suggests the latter. People complained of foul air, sought remedies, and took steps to counteract it. The debate itself reminds us that smell was not secondary. It was central to the medieval experience of sleep. Now, place yourself in such a room. The fire has burned low, leaving only the bitter tang of smoke. The damp wool blanket itches your chin. Straw beneath you releases a musty breath each time you shift. The rushes on the floor rustle, faintly as mice scurry through crumbs. Your companion beside you exhales, warm, but heavy with sweat and ale. Above it all floats a faint trace of rosemary, sprinkled days ago, now barely masking the stew of odour. The sensory reality is overwhelming. It presses into your nose and lungs, embedding itself into memory. You cough, adjust the covers, and try to breathe shallowly until sleep comes. This was normal. This was life. Peasants experienced the same, though on a smaller scale. Their cottages were filled with the smell of livestock, since animals often shared the same structure. Cows, sheep, and chickens contributed their odour, creating a pungent mixture that city travellers found unbearable, but villagers accepted as part of survival. Yet even here, herbs were used. Bunches of mint or chamomile might hang from rafters, partly for fragrance, partly to ward off pests. For nobles, perfumes, and incense occasionally improved matters. Incense burned in braziers added sweetness to the air, though it mingled oddly with smoke and damp. Perfumed oils dabbed on clothes, or linens created pockets of pleasant scent in an otherwise heavy atmosphere. But even the richest chamber could not escape the fundamental odour of medieval life. So when you imagine sleeping in a castle, do not picture crisp linen and fresh air. Picture instead a medley of smoke, damp wool, straw, sweat, herbs, and animals. Every night, every breath reminded you of where you lived and what you endured. Smell was as much a part of medieval sleep as blankets or fire, and, perhaps over time, the very familiarity of those odour brought a kind of comfort. To breathe smoke and wool and straw was to breathe home. For the medieval sleeper, scent was not only inconvenience, it was identity woven into every night's dream. After the smoke, damp wool, and musty straw, another force helped medieval peoples survive the night: food and drink. You might not think of supper as part of sleep, but what you ate before bed and what warmth it gave inside your body mattered as much as any blanket. In winter, households leaned on hearty pottages. Thick stews of barley, peas, and root vegetables simmered slowly in great cauldrons. These meals clung to the body, leaving a heavy fullness that made the cold easier to bear. The heat of the broth lingered in the stomach, spreading outward, convincing you that you could endure a freezing chamber a little longer. A noble household might enrich the dish with meat, spices, or cream, while peasants relied on onions, cabbage, and whatever scraps were available. One curious note in a 15th century English manuscript advises eating leeks at night because they warm the belly and chase away the chill of death. Whether or not that claim held true, it shows how strongly people linked diet with warmth and survival. A hot meal was not simply nourishment, it was insulation from the inside out. Drinks played an equally important role. A was the most common. Consumed by rich and poor alike. Served warm in winter, it filled bellies with calories and provided liquid comfort. Spiced wine, or hippoca, became a noble favourite. Heated, gently and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves imported from far away lands. Imagine sipping such a drink in a smoky chamber, the aroma of exotic spices mingling with wool and ash, the sweetness burning in your throat, leaving you drowsy and warm. There's even a record from the court of Charles V, 6th of France, where the king's physician recommended hot mead at night to prevent chill from entering the bones. The idea was not far from our modern habit of drinking tea before bed. though medieval science wrapped it in humoral theory, the belief that warm, moist drinks balanced the body's inner fluids. Scholars still debate how much alcohol contributed to warmth versus simply giving the illusion of it. Some argue that ale and wine dulled perception, making sleepers believe they were warmer than they were. Others point to the real caloric benefit of these drinks, which did provide energy through long, cold nights. The truth may be somewhere in between, a mix of genuine warmth and psychological comfort. Now imagine yourself preparing for bed. A servant hands you a wooden cup of mulled wine. The surface steams, sending waves of spiced aroma into your nose. You drink, the liquid glowing as it slips down your throat. Your body relaxes, muscles loosening, eyelids heavy. When you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more inviting, as though the warmth already lives inside you. For peasants, the ritual was simpler, but no less important. A bowl, two of hot porridge, thickened with oats or barley, lined the stomach. Families huddled around the fire to eat, their faces glowing in the light, their bodies fueled for the long night ahead. Children licked the last scraps from wooden spoons before curling under blankets. The memory of warmth from food helped them ignore the drafts sneaking through the shutters. A curious folk, belief held that garlic eaten before bed prevented frostbite. Whether this was because garlic genuinely improved circulation, or simply because it was warming to the palate, the habit endured. Farmers in cold regions sometimes chewed cloves of garlic before lying down, the pungent scent filling the chamber as strongly as smoke or wool. The sensory world of medieval bedtime food is vivid. The bubbling cauldron, the hiss of wine heating over the fire, the smell of herbs and spices, mingling with damp rushes, the heavy weight of stew in the stomach. Every flavour was part of the fight against cold. So, when you think of medieval sleep, do not separate it from the supper that came before. Food was fuel, warmth, and even a form of medicine. Without it, the cold was sharper, the blankets thinner, the night longer. With it, the body endured. Every spoonful, every swallow, was another layer of defense, an inner blanket, invisible but essential, against the freezing stone around you. Think now of the most vulnerable people inside a medieval castle. The children and the elderly. Their bodies, less resilient to cold, often bore the brunt of winter's cruelty. If a healthy adult knight or servant shivered through the night, a child might wake blue-lipped, and an old woman might not wake at all. Survival. For these groups depended on extra care, communal support, and sometimes sheer luck. Household records from noble families show that children were rarely given their own chambers. Instead, they slept in nurseries, close to the warmth of kitchens, or clustered with servants. Young pages and squires, destined for training, often bunked together in crowded rooms, their laughter and chatter muffled by blankets at night. The logic was simple. More bodies meant more heat. Babies especially were swaddled in layer after layer of linen and wool. A cradle stood near the hearth, or in some cases directly inside the bed of the mother, where her body heat shielded the infant from the freezing air. One poignant account from a 14th century chronicle describes a noble child laid by the fire in a wicker crib wrapped in furs and covered with a canopy. The detail suggests the lengths families went to protect their youngest. Yet even so, illness and cold claimed many lives. Medieval parents lived with constant fear that winter might take a child in the night. The elderly faced similar perils. Frail bodies produced less heat and tolerated fewer drafts. In peasant cottages, grandparents often slept closest to the fire, while younger adults accepted colder spots. In castles, aged relatives were placed in smaller chambers, or even moved into kitchens during the coldest months. A curious letter from Burgundy tells of an elderly matron who insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse, arguing that the oven's residual warmth gave her a second Youth. Medical texts of the period often advised special measures for the old and young. Physicians recommended heated stones, wrapped in cloth, to be placed at their feet or mulled drinks to fortify the spine humours. They warned that sudden chills could extinguish the flame of life, a vivid reminder of how vulnerable these groups were. Historians continue to discuss whether medieval families treated children and elders with extra indulgence or simply folded them into the same survival strategies as everyone else. Some argue that the emphasis on protecting them reflects deep compassion. Others point out that mortality rates remained high, suggesting limits to what families could realistically do. The tension between care and inevitability shaped how people viewed age and childhood. Now imagine the scene of a winter's night in a peasant cottage. A baby lies swaddled tightly, his tiny face barely visible. A grandmother snores softly by the hearth, the faint glow of embers painting her cheeks red. Parents tuck cloaks over both, ensuring they receive the warmest spots. Children crowd together on a straw mattress, giggling until exhaustion silences them. The chamber smells of porridge, smoke, and wool, but the warmth of family togetherness lingers. In a castle, the image is different, but no less vivid. A nursemaid rocks a cradle near the fire, humming softly, while a child whimpers against the chill. Upstairs, an elderly noblewoman insists her bed curtains be drawn tight, while a servant places hot stones at her feet. She mutters prayers, clutching a rosary, fearful of the cold's creeping hand. In both worlds, the youngest and oldest require the most attention, and sometimes even that isn't enough. The sensory detail is striking. The crackle of logs, as they're added to the fire. The soft rustle of swaddling cloth. The weaves of an old man adjusting under blankets. You feel the fragility in the air, as though the cold waits for a moment of weakness to strike. So when you think of medieval sleep, remember that it was not equal for all. Children and elders carried the heaviest risks, their survival dependent on the warmth provided by others. In those long nights, every blanket, every ember, every whispered prayer mattered. They remind us that medieval sleep was not only about individual endurance, but about community, the young and old, carried through winter by the care and vigilance of those around them. The cold didn't just gnaw skin and bone. It shaped how people thought about health itself. To a medieval mind, chill wasn't simply uncomfortable, it was dangerous. A force that could warp the body's inner balance and invite disease. Medicine in this era revolved around the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And physicians believed temperature played a vital role in keeping those fluids in harmony. 2. Much cold, your humours congealed, clogging the body and making you ill. Medical treatises from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with advice on combating this problem at night. 1. Manual suggested rubbing feet with warm oil before bed to open the pores and expel the harmful chill. Another recommended drinking heated milk with honey, claiming it soothed the stomach and kept the humours from turning sluggish. Physicians viewed warmth as medicine in itself, prescribing heat in every form: food, drink, clothing, and even proximity to others. There's a fascinating record from a French surgeon who warned that sleeping in damp chambers could breed melancholy by chilling the black bile. He advised hanging tapestries not for beauty, but for medical necessity. Imagine being told by your doctor that failing to decorate your walls properly might make you depressed. It shows how deeply climate and medicine were intertwined. At the same time, folk cures flourished. Some people believed rubbing garlic or onion on the soles of the feet before sleep prevented chills from entering the body. Others tied charms of wool soaked in wine around their wrists. A curious prescription from an English herbal advises keeping a live rooster in the Rokshan bedroom to draw away the frost from man. Whether anyone truly slept with a squawking chicken nearby is uncertain, but the belief reveals just how desperate people were for remedies. Modern scholars still debate how effective medieval health practices against cold really were. Some argue that oils, heated drinks, and herbal remedies did provide modest relief, easing circulation and offering psychological comfort. Others insist most of these treatments were symbolic, offering little real benefit beyond placebo. The disagreement continues. But what's certain is that people believed wholeheartedly in the power of these nightly rituals. Now, imagine yourself preparing for bed under such advice. You sit by the hearth while a servant massages warm oil into your feet, the smell of rosemary filling the chamber. You drink a small cup of heated wine sweetened with honey and feel it coat your throat. A spring rig of garlic rests near the bed, pungent and strange, meant to ward off frost. You climb into bed, convinced that these remedies will keep your humours balanced until morning. The sensory experience is intense. The slick warmth of oil on your skin, the sweet tang of honeyed wine, the acrid bite of garlic in the air. Every detail reminds you that sleep was not only a battle against discomfort, but a medical practice, a nightly therapy against the filing threat of imbalance. Peasants too had their own remedies. Women brewed herbal, teas of nettle or chamomile for children, believing the warmth prevented coughs. Men wrapped their legs in wool, soaked in vinegar, to keep circulation strong. In cottages, these practices blurred the line between superstition and science. But they gave people agency in a world where illness often felt inevitable. The irony, of course, is that many ailments came from the very strategies used to combat cold. Fires filled lungs with smoke, heavy blankets triggered joint pain, and oily ointments collected dirt. Yet to medieval minds, these were minor costs compared to the greater peril of frost seeping into the body. Better to cough in a smoky room than freeze in a clean one. So when you picture medieval sleep, remember it wasn't just a matter of enduring discomfort. It was wrapped in theories of health, remedies both strange and familiar, and a constant anxiety that cold might tip the balance of life itself. Every night was a medical event, every blanket and herb a prescription, every ember a treatment, and to drift into slumber was to trust that these efforts were enough to carry you through until morning. Even with fires, blankets, herbs and charms, there were nights when none of it was enough. Step into a castle chamber at the height of winter, and you might see something uncanny, frost blooming on the inside walls. Imagine lying in bed and noticing a delicate lace of ice tracing the stones, or waking to find your wash basin frozen solid. The water inside turned to a glassy block. The cold didn't stay politely outdoors, it invaded, decorating rooms with its own cruel artistry. Chroniclers record moments when entire households woke to frost on their bed curtains. One noble woman wrote in a letter that her canopy glittered as though sewn with silver, meaning the moisture from her own breath had crystallized overnight. To us it sounds poetic. To her it was miserable proof of how inhospitable even a well-furnished chamber could be. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. In certain preserved castles, faint salt streaks and moisture stains suggest how water condensed on walls and floors. Without insulation, warm indoor air met freezing stone, and frost took hold. Servants scraped ice away in the mornings, only for it to return each night. A curious anecdote survives from Scandinavia. In some halls, icicles formed on rafters indoors, dripping onto place, unlucky sleepers below. Servants hung cloths to catch the meltwater, a primitive solution to an unnerving problem. Imagine drifting off and hearing the faint crack of ice above, wondering if a shard would fall onto your bed. Scholars still discuss how common this phenomenon was. Some believe frost indoors was typical only of northern Europe, where winters were harsher. Others argue that even in temperate regions, poorly heated stone chambers easily reached freezing temperatures. The truth may be both. Severity varied by region, but the risk of waking to ice inside your room was never far away. Now put yourself in that situation. You wake in the dim grey of dawn, breath fogging in the air. The bed, curtains are stiff, edged with frozen crystals. When you reach for the wash basin, your fingers touch ice instead of water. Your joints ache from the cold, and the thought of leaving the covers feels like punishment. The sensory detail is vivid, the sharp sting of frozen fabric against your skin, the brittle creak of wood shrunk by frost, the silence broken only by the faint drip of melting ice. Peasants lived with the same problem, though in different forms. In cottages, frost coated the inside of thatch and rafters, drifting down like snow during the night. Children sometimes woke with frost clinging to their hair. Parents joked grimly about sleeping with the clouds indoors. Yet humour could not disguise the hardship. Frostbite, chilblains, and respiratory illness followed in its wake. Nobles, despite their wealth, couldn't entirely escape it. Hot stones and furs kept the body alive, but the surrounding air remained hostile. Diaries hint at the psychological toll. People spoke of dreading the moment they had to leave bed in the morning, of feeling imprisoned by blankets because the room beyond was too cruel to face. One English poet even turned it into metaphor, writing of love as a bed, without frost inside the hangings. For him, true intimacy meant defying the nightly chill, creating warmth where the world offered only ice. It reveals how deeply the experience of frost shaped imagination, as well as reality. So, as you think of medieval sleep, remember the surreal beauty of those nights when cold decorated the very walls. To live in a castle was to share your chamber with ice. To wake each morning reminded that stone and frost were allies against frost, your comfort. And yet people endured, scraping ice away, layering blankets, whispering prayers, and braving mornings that felt as harsh indoors as out. Picture yourself not in a castle this time, but on the road, far from familiar chambers. Medieval travel was slow, arduous, and dangerous. And when night fell, the problem of warmth became even more acute. Castles had their fireplaces and tapestries. Peasants had their family hearths. But travellers, pilgrims, merchants, wandering knights had to seek shelter wherever they could find it, and that usually meant inns. The medieval inn was not the cosy picture postcard you might imagine. Instead, it was often a timber structure with a smoky hall, crowded rooms, and beds shared by strangers. Guests might be packed 3 or 4 to a mattress, blankets stretched thin, and privacy non-existent. Still, inns provided one crucial thing: heat. The main hall fire blazed for everyone, and bodies crowded, together multiplied warmth. One traveller in 15th century Italy complained that the beds were alive with vermin, but admitted that at least the company of fellow guests meant he did not freeze. Imagine crawling into a straw mattress, squeezing beside 2 strangers, the smell of ale and sweat filling your nostrils. Unpleasant, yes, but at least your toes survived the night. There were odder accommodations too. Some inns were so poorly equipped that guests slept in stables. At first glance, this seems degrading, but travellers sometimes preferred it. Horses and cattle radiated warmth, and a stable packed with animals could be far cosier than a drafty upstairs room. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago occasionally wrote of choosing stalls on purpose, curling up against hay bales with livestock, their breath mingling with the animals. The odour was strong, but the heat was undeniable. In more rural areas, hospitality followed older traditions. Villagers were expected to open their doors to travellers, especially pilgrims or those carrying religious tokens. A peasant family might offer a spot by the fire or space on a straw pallet. Warmth here came not from luxury, but from generosity and closeness. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder with strangers, listening to the crackle of a humble hearth, the smell of stew still lingering in the rafters. A curious record from a 14th century French town describes communal inns where long, wooden platforms were laid out, covered in straw, and dozens of travellers lay side by side, men and women alike. The idea of strangers pressed together might unsettle us today, but then it was normal. Shared warmth outweighed any awkwardness. Scholars discuss whether such inns offered more comfort than castles. Some argue yes. Though crowded and unhygienic, they retained warmth better than vast noble chambers. Others point to the dangers lice, fleas, theft, and suggest that castle life, for all its cold, at least offered safety. Both perspectives are valid. For the weary medieval traveller, survival often meant choosing between cold isolation and crowded discomfort. Now, imagine yourself in one of these inns. You enter the hall, greeted by the roar of voices and fire. The smell of ale, smoke, and roasted meat envelops you. The space is cleared on a straw pallet, and you squeeze in beside strangers. The floor cacks, dogs bark, mugs clatter, and yet the warmth of the crowd makes your limbs relax. Later, when the hall quiets and snores replace laughter, you feel the freft heat of bodies pressed close, the embers glowing faintly in the hearth. It is not comfort as you know it, but it is enough. The sensory details are striking. The scratch of straw through thin linen, the heavy scent of sweat and smoke, the rhythmic breathing of a dozen sleepers. You shift, trying not to disturb your neighbour, and eventually, the murmur of the inn lulls you into a shallow but necessary sleep. Even nobles faced this reality when travelling. Royal progressions required armies of attendants, and inns overflowed quickly. Records describe monarchs lodging in monasteries or commandeering entire households for their retinues. But even kings could not escape the fundamental challenge. Warmth was scarce, and the road stripped away layers of privilege. So in the tapestry of medieval sleep, remember the traveller. For him, each night was uncertain, each bed a gamble. Would it be a flea-ridden pallet, a stable with horses, a stranger's cottage, floor, or if fortune smiled, a monastery guest hall? Wherever it was, the same goal remained: to trap enough warmth to see another dawn. Every household found the ways to endure, but not everyone succeeded. The medieval world left behind stories, half history, half legend of those who faced nights so cold. They became the stuff of cautionary tales. To sleep in a castle was to fight an invisible enemy, and sometimes the cold one. One grim chronicle from the 13th century tells of guards posted on a castle wall in Flanders who froze at their posts during a bitter winter siege. By dawn, their comrades found them still upright, spears in hand, bodies stiff with ice. The chronicler noted it not as tragedy but as proof of winter's cruelty, as though the cold itself were a weapon of war. Imagine the eerie sight. Men transformed into statues. Overnight, their watchfires long extinguished. There were softer, more personal tales as well. A letter from a noble woman in Burgundy recounts how her cousin, visiting from Italy, trembled all the night and begged for dawn, for he had never known such frost. The man survived, but the story was retold with laughter, mocking him for his weakness, while quietly acknowledging the terror of a night that seemed endless. A curious folk story from Scandinavia speaks of a bride who entered her new husband's castle only to collapse from the shock of the cold chamber. Villagers whispered that she had been cursed by the ice spirits of the north. Whether she died from illness or simply from exposure, the tale lived on as a warning. Even noble marriages could be tested by stone walls and winter winds. Scholars remain divided on how literally we should take these accounts. Were they exaggerated for drama, turning ordinary hardship into legend? Or do they reflect real devastating losses to frostbite and hypothermia in an age without insulation? Some believe chroniclers inflated stories for moral lessons, while others see them as accurate records of a climate harsher than ours today. Now imagine yourself hearing such tales in a great hall. The fire burns low, shadows dance on the walls, and an old retainer tells the story of a knight who perished in his sleep because he trusted too few blankets. Children listen wide-eyed, clutching their cloaks tighter. These stories serve not only as entertainment, but as warnings. Take the cold seriously, or it will take you. Even travellers' accounts sometimes carried this tone of caution. Pilgrims wrote of companions lost on mountain passes, their bodies discovered in spring, curled as if still asleep. Soldiers on campaign described comrades who never rose from their bedrolls, their cloaks stiff with frost. The line between sleep and death blurred too easily when temperatures dropped. The sensory details of such nights are chilling. The sting of frost on bare skin, the numbness creeping through fingers and toes, the dread of closing your eyes and not opening them again. To lie down in a freezing chamber was to gamble. Blankets, fires, and prayers were the stakes. Survival was the prize. But alongside these grim tales, there were also stories of endurance. Peasants boasted of winters survived in humble cottages where closeness and fire kept families alive. Nobles celebrated hunts and feasts in mid-winter, proof that their wealth conquered the season. For every account of loss, there were voices declaring resilience, framing survival itself as a kind of victory. Perhaps that is why legends of freezing nights persisted. They reminded listeners that castles, for all their strength, were not invulnerable. Stone walls kept out armies, but not winter. And in the long, dark hours, even the mightiest lord depended on blankets, fires, and companions, just like the humblest peasant. So, as you imagine medieval, sleep, hold both truths together. The stories of those who succumbed to frost and the quiet triumphs of those who endured. Every tale carried a lesson. Respect the night, guard against the cold, and never assume survival was guaranteed. At last, you return to the hearth, the symbol that held every medieval sleeper in its glow. The fire was never just a tool. It was the heart of the household. The boundary between life and death on winter nights. Its light cast shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to move like guardians, flickering and shifting as the flames rose and fell. To sleep in a castle was to live in a dialogue with fire. You feared it, you needed it, you could not survive without it. The hearth's presence dominated every sense. The snap of oak logs echoed like a heartbeat in the chamber. Sparks leapt upward, leaving faint trails of light before vanishing into the chimney. The smell of burning resin clung to tapestries and hair. Heat radiated in uneven waves, baking your face while your back froze. The hearth was a paradox, both savior and tormentor, life-giver and smoky tyrant. Nobles celebrated fire as a mark of status. A blazing hearth meant wealth, the ability to command servants to gather endless fuel, to strip forests if necessary, to keep flames alive through the night. Some households even employed dedicated fire wardens, servants whose sole duty was to ensure that embers never died. To let the hearth grow cold was more than inconvenience, it was disgrace. Yet the poorest also gathered around their humble fires with the same reverence. Peasants squatted on earthen floors, huddled with family and livestock, watching flames lick at rough logs. They laughed, told stories, prayed, and passed bowls of stew. Theirs was not the grandeur of carved stone hearths, but the comfort was no less real. In both castle and cottage, fire drew people together and made sleep possible. A curious account from a traveller in Germany describes villagers circling the hearth and stretching their hands toward it before bed, whispering blessings as though the flames themselves were sacred. They believed the fire carried their hopes into the night, protecting them as they slept. It reveals how practical necessity blurred into ritual. The fire was not only warmth, but spirit, memory, and faith. Historians still wrestle with how much of this reverence was practical versus symbolic. Some argue it was purely survival, instinct dressed in custom. Others suggest fire was genuinely spiritual, a force woven into cosmology and daily prayer. Perhaps both are true. Medieval people lived close enough to danger that fire naturally became more than fuel. It became meaning. Now picture yourself in your imagined castle one last time. The bed curtains are drawn, blankets piled high. Outside the wind lashes the public towers. Snow hisses against shutters, and the night presses in with all its weight. But in the great hearth, embers still glow, their faint light slipping through cracks in the curtains. You close your eyes, hearing the low sigh of flames, knowing they are the thin line holding the frost at bay. The sensory experience is complete, the taste of smoke still on your tongue, the weight of wool and fur across your chest, the warmth of a dog curled at your feet, the whisper of a prayer echoing in your head. You drift toward dreams, knowing that sleep in the Middle Ages was never easy, never assured, but always fought for with every trick, ritual, and the fragment of warmth available. In the end, castles were fortresses against men, but never against winter. What saved their inhabitants was not stone or steel, but resilience, invention, and community. To survive the night meant layering blankets, sharing heat, burning fuel, and clinging to hope against the prodling, endless chill of the medieval night. Humanity itself became the true fire. Now let the pace soften. Imagine the embers glowing faintly, their light, no, longer fierce, but gentle, like coals resting after long labour. The chamber is quiet, the rush of wind beyond the walls, fading to a distant murmur. You feel the weight of blankets, heavy and protective, pressing you down into the mattress. The struggle of cold, the vigilance of fires, the noise of dogs and servants. All of it recedes as though you have drawn a curtain across the world. Your breathing slows. Each inhale tastes faintly of smoke and wool. Each exhale drifts into the still air. The sounds that once echoed boots on stone, shutters rattling, monks chanting, are now memories softened into whispers. The castle itself seems to sleep, its stones holding silence like a promise. Picture yourself safe within, to your cocoon. The dog at your feet sigh and shifts. The last candle gutters out, and darkness folds around you like another blanket. The cold is still there, yes, but you no longer fight it. You accept it as those before you did, knowing that sleep is a fragile truce. With the night, your body grows heavier. Thoughts dissolve into shapes and colours. The medieval world, with all its chill and smoke, becomes distant, like frost melting in sunlight. What remains is only calm. You are warm enough, safe enough, tired enough, and so the story closes. The hearth flickers, the bed holds you, and the long night carries you gently into dreams. Rest now as they once did, wrapped in quiet resilience.